Imagine you're standing in the middle of the Colosseum. Tens of thousands of people are screaming around you. The sand beneath your feet is hot, your heart is racing, and in front of you stands an opponent with a drawn weapon. You only have two options: fight or perish. The Roman gladiators were among the most famous fighters of antiquity. They were celebrated like heroes, but often lived like prisoners. But were gladiators really just brutal fighters, or is there much more to their history? Before we start, write your opinion in the comments. Would you rather sit in the audience as a free Roman or stand in the arena as a gladiator if you could gain fame and maybe even freedom by doing so? Don't forget to like the video if you're interested in history, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting topics from ancient times. And now we travel back to ancient Rome, to a world of blood, courage, and glory. Chapter 1. Prologue: Sand, Blood, and Jubilation. The sand of the arena was warm, almost hot, although the sun had not yet reached its highest point. Lucius felt the heat through the thin soles of his sandals. Every step felt heavy, as if the ground itself was trying to hold on to him. The world shook around him. Not by an earthquake, not by thunder, but by the voices of thousands of people who sat on the stone tiers of the huge amphitheater and waited for only one thing: the fight. The Colosseum was filled to the last seat that day. Men in light tunics, women with elaborately braided hair, traders, senators, soldiers, children and slaves crowded into the stands. Some laughed, others waved scarves, some shouted the names of fighters they admired. For them, this day was a celebration, a spectacle, a gift from Rome to its people. For Lucius, it was perhaps the last day of his life. He stood at the edge of the arena, still in the shadow of a huge goal. Behind him, the heavy wooden doors slowly closed. The dull crash with which they clicked into place sounded final. It was the sound of a cage, the sound of a fate from which one could no longer escape. In front of him lay the arena like a sea of light sand. But this sand was not clean. In some places it was darker, heavier, almost brown-red. Lucius didn't have to look closer to know why. Other men had fought before him. Some had won, others had been carried away. The sand was made to swallow blood. A deep breath filled his lungs. The air smelled of dust, sweat, metal, and something Lucius knew all too well: fear. It wasn't just his own fear. It hung everywhere. In the weapons of the men who stood next to him. In the eyes of the slaves waiting on the sidelines. In the eyes of the animals, whose roar came up from the underground passages. And yet this fear was almost swallowed up by the noise of the crowd. Lucius raised his eyes. Above him, the ranks rose into the sky. At the top sat the ordinary citizens, far from the sand, but loud enough to tear up every thought. Further down, the wealthy had their seats. Even closer to the arena sat the mighty of Rome. Men who could make the difference between life and death without ever having to raise a sword themselves. Their faces were calm. Some seemed bored. Others looked at the gladiators as if they were horses in a market. Lucius clenched his hand around the hilt of his sword. It was not a particularly beautiful sword. Not like the weapons he had seen in the hands of Roman officers as a child. But it was sharp, heavy enough to split a bone, short enough to be deadly in close combat. He had learned to hold it. He had learned to strike with it. He had learned not to hesitate. But that didn't mean he wanted to kill. Next to him stood another gladiator, a broad-shouldered man with scars on his arms and neck. His name was Marcellus. At school, he had been called the Bear because he seemed almost unstoppable in battle. But now his face was tense too. He stared straight ahead without blinking. His helmet was still hanging under his arm. Sweat glistened on his forehead. "Don't look at the crowd," Marcellus murmured without turning his head. Lucius did not answer. "They want you to hear them," Marcellus continued. "They want you to forget who you are. Just listen to your breath. On your feet. On your sword." Lucius nodded imperceptibly. He tried to block out the voices. But that was impossible. They came from everywhere. They crashed over him like waves. He heard his name, though he wasn't sure if the people were really calling him or just some fighter, somebody, some victim. To the crowd, he was not Lucius. He was a gladiator, a man in the sand, a character in a game that Rome had invented to feel powerful for herself. Then trumpets sounded. The noise changed immediately. Wild screaming turned into tense expectation. The spectators leaned forward. Children were lifted on shoulders. Traders interrupted their shouts. Even the birds circling above the open circle of the amphitheater seemed to become quieter for a moment. In the tribune of honor stood a man in a white toga with a purple border. His voice wasn't loud enough to reach every seat, but his gesture was clear. Servants and criers repeated his words. Several fights were to take place today. In honor of a victory. In honor of Rome. In honor of the power that wanted to celebrate itself. Lucius understood only fragments. His heart was beating too loudly. He thought of the day he had been free. It was a dangerous thought. In the Gladiator School, they had been taught to bury such memories. Memory softened. Memory made the hand tremble. Memory made a person think that he had once been more than a body with a gun. But Lucius couldn't stop her. He saw in his mind's eye a small house on the outskirts of a village. He saw his mother fetching bread from the oven. He heard the laughter of his younger brother. He smelled rain on dry ground. All that was far away, perhaps lost forever. Rome had taken it from him, just as Rome had taken something from so many people: land, freedom, names, future. A guard roughly shoved him on the shoulder. "Helmet on," he ordered. Lucius put on the helmet. Immediately, the world became narrower. The noises became duller, but not quieter. Through the narrow openings, he could only see the arena in excerpts. Sand. Shadows. Movement. Light. His own breath now sounded loud in his ears. He tasted metal on his tongue. Another gate on the opposite side opened. The crowd erupted in cheers. Lucius saw his opponent. The man slowly stepped into the arena as if it belonged to him. He was taller than Lucius, perhaps stronger, and carried a round shield and a curved dagger. His helmet was decorated with a high comb, which made him appear even more menacing. Every step he took was calm, controlled. He had fought many times before. Lucius recognized that immediately. This man was not a beginner, not a frightened prisoner stepping onto the sand for the first time. He was a survivor, and survivors were dangerous. Marcellus was no longer beside him. Each struggle had its own order, its own opponents, its own rules. Lucius stood alone. The crier called out the names of the fighters. When Lucius heard his name, a short cheer went through part of the crowd. Not because they knew him. Not really. Perhaps some had heard of him. Perhaps they had seen in previous fights that he was fast. Maybe they just liked his young face or the way he held his sword. In Rome, a man could become famous before he even knew if he would live to see the next sunset. His opponent raised his shield. Lucius did the same. For a moment, both stood still. In this silence, which arose between them despite the crowd, Lucius understood something. The man in front of him was not his true enemy. He was like Lucius. Perhaps he had also been sold. Perhaps he too had had a family. Perhaps he too dreamed at night of a place where no spectators screamed for blood. But this realization did not change anything. If Lucius didn't fight, he would die. If his opponent did not fight, he would die. The arena left no room for pity. It turned people into weapons and forced them to be turned against each other. A sign was given. The fight began. The opponent moved first. Fast, faster than Lucius had expected. The shield advanced. The dagger followed deep from the side. Lucius jumped back. The blade narrowly missed him. Sand splashed up under his feet. The crowd screamed enthusiastically. as if they had just seen an elaborate performance and not an attempt to cut open a person's stomach. Lucius forced himself to rest. Don't see the crowd. Breathe. Feet. Sword. The opponent attacked again. This time Lucius didn't just dodge. He turned to the side and let his sword crash against the shield. The blow was not strong enough to throw the man back, but strong enough to throw him off balance for a moment. A murmur went through the Colosseum. Lucius felt something awaken in him. Not courage. Not yet. Rather, the will to survive. A hard, cold spark in his chest. The opponent growled and came closer again. Step by step they circled around each other. The sand crunched. The sun was blinding. Lucius' arms became heavier. Every breath burned. But he remained attentive. He saw the opponent's shoulder before the dagger came. He saw the tension in his leg before the man jumped forward. At school, they had taught him not to stare at the gun, but at the body. The body betrayed the truth before the blade spoke it. Then Lucius made a mistake. Only a small one. His foot slipped on a dark, damp spot in the sand. For a fraction of a moment, he lost his balance. His opponent saw it immediately. The shield hit Lucius in the chest with full force. The air was squeezed out of his lungs. He fell on his back. His sword almost flew out of his hand. The crowd exploded. Lucius saw the sky above him. Blue. Outrageously calm. For a moment, he heard nothing but his own heartbeat. Then a shadow fell on him. The enemy stood over him and raised his dagger. Lucius rolled to the side. The blade struck the sand, right where his neck had been just a moment ago. With the last of his strength, Lucius kicked the man's leg. The opponent staggered. Lucius picked himself up, coughing, panting, half-blind with dust. Now the crowd shouted his name more clearly. Lucius didn't know if they were cheering him on or just hoping that the fight would last longer. Maybe they didn't care. The main thing was that something happened. The main thing was that the sand did not remain empty. His opponent came towards him again. Slower this time. Angrier. More dangerous. Lucius raised his sword. At that moment, he understood why some gladiators seemed proud despite everything. Not because they loved the arena. Not because they enjoyed killing. But because in this cruel world they had only one thing left: to decide how to stand when all eyes were on them. Lucius couldn't decide if he had to fight that day. But he could decide whether he seemed broken. He put his feet firmly in the sand. His breathing became calmer. The noise became dull, almost distant. In front of him was only the opponent. Above him the sun. In his hand the sword. And deep inside a single thought. I'm not just going to die so that Rome can entertain itself. The opponent stormed off. Lucius moved towards him. And while the Colosseum shook with jubilation, not only a fight for life and death began in the sand of the arena, but the story of a man who had lost everything, except the will to be free. Chapter 2, Rome, the City of Power. Rome was not simply a city. Rome was a promise, a threat and a dream at the same time. Those who approached the city often saw it long before they entered its streets. From afar, walls, temples, pillars and roofs rose like signs of a world larger than anything a simple person knew. Roads led there from all directions, straight and solidly built, as if Rome herself had decided that every trace in the empire had to lead to him in the end. For Lucius, Rome had not been a dream at first. It was a shadow. When he saw the city for the first time, he was not free. His hands were tied, his clothes were dirty, and his feet were covered with the dust of a long journey. He was not alone. Next to him walked other prisoners, men from different countries, with different languages, faces, and stories. Some were prisoners of war, others had been bought by traders. Some had debts that they could never pay. Still others had simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were all taken to Rome. The city did not receive them with pity. She received them with a noise. Already at the gates there were wagons, traders, soldiers, farmers, slaves, and travelers. Oxen pulled heavy loads over the cobbled streets. Wheels creaked, whips cracked, voices screamed in confusion. Merchants praised wine, olive oil, fabrics, bread and jewelry, and children ran between the adults' legs. Beggars held out their hands. Priests rushed to temples. Soldiers marched in closed ranks, their armor glistening in the sun. Lucius had never seen so many people at once. In his village, every face had been known. You knew who was sick, who would get married, who had a quarrel with their neighbor. In Rome, a single person was little more than a drop in a raging river. No one stopped to look at the prisoners. Or if someone looked, then only briefly. For the Romans, men in chains were nothing special. They were as much a part of the city's image as columns, fountains, and markets. That was the first thing Lucius learned about Rome. This city was big enough to swallow human suffering without slowing down. The further inside they got, the more Lucius felt the power of the city. Everywhere there were buildings that had been built not only to be useful, but to make an impression. Temples with high columns towered over the roofs. Statues of emperors, generals, and gods looked down on the people. Arches were reminiscent of victories that had been achieved somewhere far away. They depicted soldiers, prisoners, raids, and battles. Stein told the history of Rome, but always only from the point of view of the victors. Lucius saw these images and understood that Rome did not rule only with swords. Rome also ruled with stories, with pictures, with festivals, with a constant reminder that resistance was pointless. The people in the streets seemed accustomed to it. They passed by the signs of power as if they were part of everyday life. A woman carried a basket of vegetables on her head. An old man was arguing loudly with a trader about the price of fish. Two boys were arguing over a piece of bread. A rich citizen was carried in a litter while slaves cleared the way in front of him. No one seemed surprised by the size of the city. Only the strangers raised their heads and stared. Lucius stared as well. He hated himself for it. He wanted to despise Rome. He just wanted to feel the chains, the pain in his shoulders, the tiredness in his legs. But a part of him couldn't stop him from being amazed. The city was enormous. She was beautiful and ugly at the same time. It smelled of smoke, bread, sewage, spices, animal manure, oil, and perfume. It was full of life and full of death. It was a place where gods were worshipped and people were sold, sometimes just a few streets apart. In a large square, the procession of prisoners stopped briefly. Lucius did not know at the time that it was the Forum, one of the most important places in Rome. For him, it was just a huge space of stone, voices, and movement. Men in togas discussed politics and law there. Scribes sat ready with wax tablets. Messengers hurried from one building to the next. Traders negotiated. Judges pronounced verdicts. And everywhere there were people who wanted to be seen. Rome was a stage. Everyone played a role. The senators played power. The merchants played prosperity. The soldiers played order. The priests played proximity to the gods. And the prisoners played the defeat so that everyone else could feel stronger. Lucius felt the gaze of some children. A little boy pointed to the chains and asked his father something. The father answered without feeling in his voice. Then the boy laughed. This laugh hit Lucius harder than any blow on the way. Not because a child had to be cruel, but because it apparently learned early on that some people were worth less than others. At the edge of the Forum stood statues of men whose names Lucius did not know. Later he would learn that many Romans revered their ancestors, celebrated their victories, and preserved their honor as if fame were a second kind of life. In Rome, it was not only who you were that counted. What counted was how you were seen. A name could have power. A title could open doors. A defeat could shame an entire family. And a victory could make a man almost immortal. Perhaps that's why it wasn't a coincidence that gladiators became so important in this world. They were not free heroes. At least not most of them. Many were slaves, prisoners or convicts. And yet, in the sand of the arena, they were able to win something that even powerful Romans coveted: attention, cheers, a name. For a few moments, a man who had nothing else could be at the center of the world's largest city. This made the arena so cruel and so seductive at the same time. Lucius didn't know that at the time. He only knew that he was to be sold. The path continued through narrow streets. Rome was less magnificent here. The houses stood close together. Water was poured onto the street from windows. People crowded into narrow alleys. Everywhere there was shouting, arguing, cooking, carrying, and trading. The upper floors of some apartment buildings looked so wobbly that it seemed as if they could collapse in the next storm. In the dark corners, it smelled of illness and poverty. Rome was not only the city of the emperors. Rome was also the city of the hungry. Marble shone on the large squares. In the side streets, people fought for bread. While rich citizens celebrated festivals and let water flow from elaborate fountains in their houses, others slept in cramped rooms where there was hardly any air to breathe. These contrasts did not make the city weaker. On the contrary, they were part of their order. Everyone had their place. The senator, the soldier, the merchant, the slave, the beggar, and soon the gladiator. Lucius was led through this world like a commodity. In the end, they reached a building that looked more inconspicuous from the outside than the temples and halls, but was more threatening to him than anything he had seen before. Men were waiting there, looking at prisoners as if they were testing animals. They looked at shoulders, teeth, legs, and hands. They asked about age, origin, and strength. Some prisoners were bought for mines, others for fields, others for households. Lucius heard the word ludus for the first time that day. Gladiator School. A man with a narrow face and cold eyes stepped in front of him. He walked around Lucius, raised his arm, pressed against his shoulder, and examined his posture. Lucius wanted to spit in his face, but he knew that a single wrong step could mean a blow or worse. So he remained silent. "Young," said the man. "Not weak. Angry." Another laughed. The audience likes anger. This is how his life was decided. Not by a judge. Not by the gods. Not by his family. But of men who saw in him no son, no brother, and no man, but a way to earn money. That evening, Lucius saw the city again when he was taken to school. The sun sank behind the roofs, and Rome turned golden. For a brief moment, everything looked peaceful. The temples were shining. Smoke rose from the houses. Music could be heard in the distance. Somewhere there was a celebration. Lucius walked in chains through this light. He remembered that the Romans called their city the mistress of the world. Maybe they were right. Rome took what it wanted: gold, land, people, stories. It turned defeats into triumphal processions and prisoners into entertainment. It built roads, temples, and arenas so that no one would forget who ruled. But while Lucius was being led through the streets, he swore something to himself. Rome might possess his body. Rome wants to have his name called, train him, sell him, and send him to the sand. Rome might have believed that every person in this city played only the role that was assigned to him. But deep inside Lucius there remained a small, hard resistance. He would learn how Rome thought. He would learn why people rejoiced when others suffered. He would learn how power became a spectacle and death a feast. And perhaps one day, he would show Rome that even a man in chains could still be dangerous. Chapter 3: The Birth of the Gladiator Games. Long before Lucius stepped onto the sands of the arena, long before his name was shouted by a crowd, the gladiatorial games already had a history. They had not simply arisen suddenly, not as mere entertainment for a bored people. Its origin lay deeper, in a time when Rome was not yet the undisputed mistress of the world, and the boundaries between honor, death, religion, and power were more closely connected than Lucius could ever have imagined. In the Gladiator School, older fighters sometimes talked about it. Most of the time this happened at night, when the torches in the corridors had burned down and only weak light fell through the cells. Then the men lay on their hard sleeping places, heard the breathing of the others, and tried not to think about the next fight. On such nights, Marcellus, the most experienced of them, spoke in a calm voice about things he had heard from trainers, priests, and old gladiators. The first struggles, he once said, were not meant for the people. They were for the dead. Lucius hadn't understood what that meant at the time. For him, the games were loud, cruel, and lively. They belonged to the arenas, to trumpets, to cheers, and to the looks of the spectators. That they had once begun to grieve seemed almost impossible to him. But Marcellus continued to explain. In earlier times, he said, many people believed that blood had a special power. The death of a person was not only an end, but a transition. When an important man died, a leader, a warrior, or a member of a powerful family, they did not want to bury him quietly. They wanted to pay homage to him. They wanted to show that his life had carried weight. And sometimes it was believed that the blood of fighting men could accompany, strengthen, or soothe the dead. This is how fights arose at funerals. Not in huge amphitheaters, not in front of tens of thousands of people, but on a smaller scale. Two men were pitted against each other, often prisoners or slaves. Their fight was to honor the deceased. It was a cruel sacrifice, but in the eyes of the time, it associated death with courage, violence with dignity, and grief with public memory. Lucius listened to these stories in silence. He thought about how strange it was that something that started with a funeral could later become a folk festival. Perhaps that is why Rome was so powerful. It took old customs and turned them into tools of domination. Because the individual fight in honor of a dead man became more over time. Roman families, especially the rich and influential, quickly realized that such fights did not only honor the deceased. They also honored the living who organized them. Those who had many fighters appear showed their wealth. Those who presented particularly brave or exotic warriors showed their connections and power. Those who attracted a large audience gained prestige. So the fights became bigger. Grief turned into competition. One family wanted to surpass the other. One funeral should be more magnificent than the last. More fighters, better weapons, stronger men, more dramatic encounters. The audience got used to it. What had once begun as a serious act for the dead became more and more an event for the living. Lucius could well imagine that. He had seen Rome. He had watched the faces of the men in the forum, who were always paying attention to who was listening to them, who was greeting them, and who was admiring them. In this city, reputation was like a currency. Whoever was seen had power. Those who were forgotten were almost defeated. The gladiatorial games fit perfectly into this world. They showed strength. They showed order. They showed that Rome could even bring death into a form. In the arena, people did not die secretly, not namelessly in a dark alley, but publicly, in front of the crowd, according to rules, with weapons, music, and signs. Even violence was organized in Rome. The bigger Rome became, the bigger the games became. When Roman armies conquered new territories, prisoners came to the city. Men from Gaul, Greece, Thrace, Germania, Africa, and many other regions of the empire were brought to Rome. Some were sold as slaves, others had to work in mines, some ended up in gladiator schools. They were valuable for the organizers. A fighter from a distant country made an impression. He reminded the audience how far Rome's power extended. When a foreign warrior stood in the arena, the people didn't just see a man. They saw a defeated people, a triumph, a living proof that Rome was stronger. Lucius had experienced this truth on his own body. He had not been brought to Rome because someone was interested in his story. He was part of the loot, one of many. His suffering was not a crime for the city, but a sign of its greatness. But the games did not only serve the glory of individual families. Over time, politicians and emperors also recognized their value. Those who gave games to the people gave them distraction. Bread filled the stomach, games filled the thoughts. A citizen who rejoiced may have asked less about injustice. A people sitting in the amphitheater did not think about hunger, taxes, or war for a few hours. The arena thus became more than a place of struggle. It became a tool of power. A ruler could be generous by organizing games. He was able to prove that he was rich enough to pay for animals from distant lands, fighters, stage sets, and weapons. He was able to get the crowd on his side. When the spectators called his name, when they cheered him, then his rule had a stronger effect. Not only the army confirmed his power, but also the noise of the people. Lucius began to understand that the arena wasn't all sand. It consisted of looks, expectations, and intentions. Each battle told a story greater than the men who died in it. The organizer wanted fame. The people wanted excitement. The powerful wanted approval. The gladiators wanted to survive. And between all these wishes lay the sand. At school, the fighters were taught that they were part of an old tradition. The coaches spoke of honor, bravery, and discipline. They said that a gladiator must be able to look death in the face. He had to fight without fleeing. He had to show attitude, even if he lost. For some, that sounded proud. To Lucius, it sounded like a beautiful language for an ugly truth. For what was this honor worth if a man had no choice? A volunteer gladiator might seek fame. A condemned man might perhaps hope to wrest another chance from certain death. But for many, the arena was not a path to honor, but a cage with an open sky. They were given weapons and called courage. They were forced to kill her and called it art. They were left to die and called it tradition. Still, Lucius couldn't deny that the games had a strange power. He'd seen even the toughest men in school go quiet when a famous gladiator was mentioned. Names were whispered like legends. Fighters who had won many victories could be admired. Some received gifts. Some were celebrated by rich citizens. Some even won their freedom at some point. That made everything more complicated. The arena took everything from people, and gave back to a few of them what almost felt like a new life. This was precisely where their cruelty lay. If the arena had only been death, it would have been easier to hate. But it also offered hope. A narrow, dangerous hope, as thin as the edge of a sword. Every victory could make a man better known. Every cheer could increase its value. Every battle he survived could bring him closer to freedom. And so many gladiators clung to the only thing Rome left them, the possibility of becoming more than a victim in battle. Lucius often thought about the origin of the games. If they had really started for the dead, then in time they had transformed like a fire that gets out of control. What had once been a ritual became a spectacle. What once expressed grief became entertainment. What once belonged to a few became the property of an entire city. Perhaps this was the true birth of gladiatorial games. Not the first fight, not the first blood, not the first funeral. But the moment when people began to no longer look away. The moment they came to watch. The moment when they cheered. For Lucius, this realization was hard to bear. Because it meant that his fate was not only determined by the men who had bought him. It was also determined by the thousands who took their places, who demanded excitement, who called names and wanted to judge life and death. Without them, the arena would have been empty. Without their hunger for blood, no organizer would have paid for ever bigger games. Without their jubilation, Rome might have had less reason to turn men like him into fighters. But the stands were not empty. They were full of people. And as long as Rome rejoiced, men like Lucius would have to fight. Chapter 4: Prisoners, Slaves, and Volunteers. Not every gladiator entered the arena for the same reason. From the stands, they all looked the same: men with helmets, shields, swords, and naked fear under their armor. To the audience, they were fighters, names on a program, bodies in the sand. But behind each helmet was a different story. Some had been captured in wars. Some had been sold as slaves. Some had committed a crime and had been sentenced to the arena. And a few had voluntarily chosen this life. Lucius was not one of the volunteers. He had never dreamed of standing in the sand while thousands screamed his name. He had never wanted to negotiate his own life with a sword in his hand. His path to the arena did not begin with ambition, but with loss. He reluctantly remembered the day of his capture. And yet the memory always came back, especially at night, when a gladiator school became silent and only the distant groan of an injured fighter penetrated the walls. Then he saw the smoke in the sky again. He heard the screams. He smelled burnt wood and wet earth. Roman soldiers had come to his village, not as visitors, but as victors. For them, it was just another place on a long list. For Lucius, it had been the whole world. He had tried to escape. Many had tried. But an inexperienced young man could not hold his own against trained soldiers. The Romans were orderly, calm, and cruelly efficient. Where others panicked, they formed rows. Where others shouted, they gave orders. In the end, some villagers lay dead on the ground, others were tied up. Lucius no longer saw his mother. Neither did his brother. He did not know whether they had escaped, been abducted, or remained in the smoke. This ignorance was sometimes worse than certainty. After the capture, the path that led him to Rome began. First, he was rounded up with other men. Then came traitors. They talked to the soldiers, looked at the prisoners, negotiated prices. Lucius didn't understand all the words at the time, but he understood the looks. He was no longer a son, a brother, or a free man. He was a commodity. The stronger ones were sorted out. Men with strong arms, broad shoulders, or angry eyes could be interesting for certain buyers. Some were taken for hard work. Others for service in rich households. Some, especially the young and resilient ones, were sold to men who supplied gladiator schools. For her, a body was an investment. A strong man could be trained. A trained man could fight. One fighter was able to bring in money. So Lucius became a future gladiator even before he could hold a sword properly. At school, he quickly learned that many of his comrades had taken similar paths. They came from different areas and spoke with different accents. Some hardly understood Latin at first. Others spoke it fluently because they had already lived in the empire for a long time. But their stories were similar. War had uprooted them. Poverty had sold them. Violence had brought them to Rome. There was Brennus, a tall man from the north, whose hair was as light as straw and whose arms were covered with old scars. He had been captured in a battle. He had fought against Rome for a long time until his tribe was defeated. When he talked about his homeland, his voice became quieter. He told of forests, cold rivers, and festivals by the fire. In the arena, however, the audience was to see in him only the wild barbarian, not the man who missed his children. There was Nicanor, a Greek who could read and write. He had not been a warrior, but the son of a merchant. Debts had ruined his family. In the end, he had been sold to bring back some of the money that others had lost. He didn't hate the arena loudly. He hated her silently. His hatred was in his eyes when rich Romans talked about honor. And there was Tigranes, a man from the east who had once been a soldier. He said little about his past. Only sometimes, when he thought no one was listening, did he murmur prayers in a language Lucius didn't understand. He was carrying a small piece of cloth that obviously meant a lot to him. The guards had tried to take it away from him several times, but each time he had reacted so violently that they finally tolerated it. Even men in chains sometimes held on to something that no one should take away from them. Not all of them had come to school through war or sales. Some were convicts. These men were treated differently. They were often considered dangerous, sometimes already lost. Some had robbed, murdered, or opposed Roman laws. Others claimed to be innocent. In Rome, it made little difference in the end when a verdict was pronounced. Those who were sentenced to the arena often had little hope. Some had to compete against animals. Others were used in exhibition fights that were less about skill than about punishment. The line between execution and entertainment was thin. The audience knew that. Perhaps that was what made it so appealing. It could watch and convince itself that the dying deserved their fate. Lucius feared these men at first. Some were brutal, loud, and unpredictable. But over time, he realized that not all of them were the same. There were criminals who were proud of their deeds. There were desperate people who had fallen into violence due to hunger or debt. And there were men who were guilty only because Rome had declared them enemies. In the Gladiator School, such differences became blurred. Origin, crime, language, and previous position meant less than the question of whether a man could fight. A former robber was able to train next to a captured farmer. A former soldier was able to teach an indebted merchant how to survive. A slave could become more famous in the arena than a free citizen in the cheap stands. And then there were the volunteers. Lucius understood her the least. Why should a free man take an oath to be beaten, burned, bound, and killed? Why would someone voluntarily go to a school from which others only dreamed of escaping? The answer was not easy. Some volunteers were poor. They had nothing to lose and hoped to win money, food, and fame as gladiators. Others were adventurers, debtors, or men who wanted to leave their old lives behind. Some actually sought the glory of the arena. They wanted to be admired, wanted to hear their name, wanted to prove that they were stronger than others. One of them was called Cassian. He was not a slave, not a prisoner, and not a condemned man. He had sold himself, even if only for a certain time. When Lucius saw him for the first time, he could hardly believe it. Cassian was well-groomed, spoke confidently, and wore his scars like jewelry. He claimed that a life without risk was not a life. He said that in the arena a man could truly grow great. Lucius thought he was crazy. One evening, after a hard training session, he asked him directly, "Why are you here? You could have lived outside." Cassian just smiled tiredly. "I was nobody outside. And here you are a prisoner. At least I'm a prisoner here who you can look at." These words remained in Lucius' memory. They showed him another side of the arena. For him, it was a place of loss. For Cassian, it was a way to escape the void. A poor free man could be invisible in Rome. No one heard his name. No one paid attention to his courage. No one wrote down his story. As a gladiator, however, he could be at the center of the world for a moment. For some, this prospect was stronger than the fear of death. Lucius despised this thought, but understood it a little. Because the longer he lived in school, the more clearly he felt how much people wanted to be seen. Even men who hated the arena straightened up when others praised its courage. A successful practice match, an appreciative nod from the trainer, a rumor about an upcoming performance. All of these could take on meaning in this dark world. Those who had lost everything sometimes clung to the smallest remnant of pride. But whether a man was captured, sold, condemned, or came voluntarily, as soon as he took the oath of gladiators, he belonged to the school. His body has been tested, molded, and punished. His food, his sleep, his weapons, and his movements were controlled. He learned to respond to commands, endure pain, and hide fear. The way to the arena made a single group out of different fates. But beneath the surface, the differences remained. A prisoner of war may have fought with hatred against Rome. A slave fought out of obedience. One convict fought because he had no other choice. A volunteer fought for fame or money. Some wanted to survive. Some wanted to win. Some wanted to die, but not kneeling. The arena looked simple from the outside. 2 men, 2 weapons, 1 fight. In truth, entire lives stood against each other there. Lucius began to understand that the term gladiator hit a lot. He made roles out of people. He gave them helmets, armor, and names that the audience liked. But before they became gladiators, they had been sons, brothers, fathers, debtors, soldiers, farmers, thieves, dreamers, or desperate people. Rome took all these stories and threw them into the same sand. Some nights, Lucius wondered what story the audience saw in him. Did they see a wild prisoner? A young fighter? A future hero? Or just a body that was good enough to provide entertainment? He didn't know. But he knew that he was more than what Rome wanted to make of him. He had not come voluntarily. He had not sought an oath out of fame. He hadn't asked to live in the shadow of the Colosseum. But now he was here, between prisoners, slaves, condemned, and volunteers. Each of them carried a different past, but they all shared the same future: the sand, the noise, and the question of whether they would survive the next fight. And Lucius swore to himself that the arena would not end his story. Not while he could still breathe. Chapter 5: The Gladiator School. The Gladiator School was not a place to arrive. It was a place where you disappeared. When Lucius stood in front of its walls for the first time, he immediately sensed that this building was different from the noisy streets of Rome. Outside, the city raged on, full of voices, wagon wheels, merchants, and people who followed their everyday lives. But behind the high walls of the school, a world of its own seemed to begin. A world of discipline, pain, sweat, and obedience. A world in which people were turned into fighters. The gate was heavy and studded with iron. 2 armed guards stood in front of it and looked at the newcomers as if they were animals that had been herded into a stable. Lucius was tired from the journey, hungry and sore at the wrists, where the shackles had chafed his skin. Next to him stood other men, some taller, some older, some with a blank stare. No one spoke. Even Cassian, the volunteer fighter, seemed quieter than usual for a moment. When the gate was opened, Lucius smelled the school before he saw it properly. It was a heavy smell: dust, oil, leather, sweat, old blood, boiled porridge, and damp stone walls. No smell of death, not directly. Rather, the smell of bodies that were forced to their limits every day. Gladiators were already training in the courtyard. Some hit stakes with wooden swords. Others practiced with shields, wrestled with each other, or ran in circles under the orders of the instructors. Every blow sounded muffled. Every breath seemed to be work. Lucius stopped involuntarily. An overseer thrust the shaft of a stick into his back. "Continue." Lucius stumbled forward. The school was built around a large training ground. Around it were sleeping rooms, armories, storage rooms, kitchens, small treatment rooms for the injured, and the instructors' rooms. Walls, gates, and men with whips or sticks watched over everything. There was no place where you were really alone. Even if you weren't seen, you could be heard. And even if you were not heard, the certainty remained that escape was hardly possible. The new men were lined up. An older man stepped in front of her. It wasn't particularly tall, but it carried itself with the self-assurance of a man whose word was law here. His hair was short, his face hard, and an old scar ran across his right cheek. He wore no ostentatious armor, no signs of special dignity. Nevertheless, even some of the training gladiators fell silent when he appeared. "I'm Varro," he said. "For you, I am the lanista." Lucius already knew the word. The lanista was the owner or director of a gladiator school. In Rome, such a man could become rich if his fighters were good. He bought bodies, had them trained, and earned money from their performances. His profession was useful to society, but not necessarily honorable. For the gladiators themselves, he was much more than a businessman. He was the man who decided their food, their punishments, their struggles, and sometimes their lives. Varro walked slowly along the line. "Some of you may think you're already men," he said. "Warriors, soldiers, robbers, heroes. Forget that. Here you are nothing. Nothing yet." He stopped in front of Brennus and examined his broad shoulders. "Strength alone will not save you." Then he went on to Nicanor. "Prudence alone will not save you." Finally, he stopped in front of Lucius. His eyes were cold, but not empty. They tested him in a way that made Lucius uncomfortable. Not like a trader who only saw muscles. Varro saw attitude, despite, fear, maybe even hope. "Anger won't save you either," he said quietly. Lucius returned the look, even though he knew it was dangerous. Varro didn't smile. But it can be useful if tamed. Then the recording began. Every man was examined. Injuries were noted, teeth examined, limbs moved, muscles palpated. The school wanted to know what she had bought. A man with a broken body was worth less. A strong man without discipline was dangerous, but malleable. A fast man could be trained to a certain type of fighter. One heavy man to another. Lucius hated every touch, but he gritted his teeth. Afterwards, their hair was shortened, their old clothes were taken away and replaced by simple tunics. It was a small process, but for Lucius it felt like another loss. His clothes had hardly meant anything after his journey, and yet they had been the last remnant of his former life. When it was taken from him, it was as if Rome had snatched another piece of memory from his hands. Later, the men were taken to their bedrooms. The room was cramped, but not as neglected as Lucius had expected. On the walls there were simple bearings. Some blankets, few personal belongings, clay jugs with water. The school was not an inn, but it was also not a place where the fighters were left to deteriorate unnecessarily. Gladiators were valuable. A sick or starving fighter brought no money. Therefore, they were fed, treated, and trained, not out of kindness, but out of calculation. Dinner consisted of a thick porridge, beans, some bread and water. Not a feast, but more than some slaves in Rome got. The men ate in silence. Only the experienced gladiators spoke to each other, calmly and concisely. They watched the newcomers out of the corner of their eyes. Not hostile, but scrutinizing. At school, everyone had to know who was standing next to them. A weakling could interfere with training. A hothead could bring trouble. A traitor could be deadlier than an opponent in the arena. Lucius sat down next to Nicanor. The Greek stirred his porridge as if he were looking for an answer in it. "Have you ever fought?" Lucius asked quietly. Nicanor shook his head. "Only with words." "Then they will break you." Nicanor looked at him. "Maybe. But words sometimes break people slower than swords." Lucius didn't know what to say. The next morning, the real life of the school began. They were woken up before sunrise. A blast of a horn echoed through the corridors, followed by the shouts of the guards. Those who stood up too slowly got a blow. No one was interested in tiredness. Pain is only of interest if it prevents training. The men were driven into the courtyard, where the air was still cool and the sky above the walls shimmered gray. First they had to run. Round after round until the legs burned and the breath cut sharply in the chest. This was followed by exercises with stones, wooden poles, and heavy shields. They lifted, carried, pushed, ducked, stood up again. Again and again. The instructors paid attention to everything: posture, balance, reaction, obedience. Lucius quickly realized that power was only a small part of the fight. Many men were able to strike. Few were able to do it cleanly after an hour of exhaustion. Many could get angry. Few were able to direct their anger. Many wanted to survive. Few were willing to suffer every day in such a way that survival was even possible. After the basic exercises, wooden weapons were distributed. The first sword Lucius received at school was not a real sword. It was made of wood, but heavier than he had expected. The instructor explained that practice weapons were often intentionally heavier than real weapons. Those who trained with them would later be faster with metal. Lucius doubted whether he would even live long enough to feel this advantage. His first opponent in training was a man named Dama, an experienced gladiator with calm eyes. Dama raised his wooden sword and waited. Lucius attacked immediately. It was a mistake. Dama dodged barely visible, hitting Lucius on the arm, then on the ribs, then on the leg. Lucius fell to one knee before he even realized what had happened. Pain chased through his body. In the courtyard, some men laughed. Dama did not kick him. He just waited. "Once again," said the instructor. Lucius stood up. Again he attacked. He was hit again. This time on his wrist, so hard that his fingers went numb. The wooden sword fell into the sand. The instructor yelled at him to pick it up. Lucius did. On the third attempt, he lasted longer, but not much. Dama was no stronger than Brennus and no faster than Cassian, but he didn't waste any movement. He did not fight with anger. He struggled with experience. At the end of the training, Lucius' arms were shaking. His pride hurt almost more than his ribs. In the days that followed, he learned the rules of the school. There were fixed times for eating, training, cleaning, gun care, and sleep. There were punishments for disobedience, laziness, and strife. There were rewards for progress, good posture, and victories in the practice battle. Some men were allowed to receive better food. Some were given special treatment by doctors. Some received small perks if they were valuable to the school. Everything had a purpose. The school didn't want wild men. Wild men died quickly. She wanted fighters who were spectacular but controllable. Men who attacked at the right moment, backed away at the right moment, and gave the spectators a fight that was exciting enough to bring in money. The arena might look like chaos, but there was order behind it. Lucius hated this order, and yet his body began to adapt to her. He got up faster. He held the shield higher. He learned not to strike back blindly immediately after a hit. He learned how to fall without breaking his arm. How to breathe when the helmet is running out of air. How to observe the opponent without being deceived by his weapon. Little things. Vital things. Marcellus watched him often. One evening, when Lucius was standing alone in the courtyard, still beating a pole with his wooden sword, the elder gladiator came up to him. "You hit as if you wanted to hit Rome," he said. Lucius wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Maybe I want to. Rome doesn't bleed when you hit a stake." Lucius struck again. Marcellus took the wooden sword from his hand. Not roughly, but firmly. "Your opponent will not be Rome," he said. "Your opponent will be a man. Someone like you. If you only see him as Rome, you're going to make mistakes." Lucius was silent. "In this school you don't just learn to kill," Marcellus continued. "You learn to survive. It's not the same thing." These words accompanied Lucius for a long time. Because slowly he understood that the Gladiator School would change him, whether he wanted to or not. It would harden his body, sharpen his vision, and shape his movements. She would try to bury his past and make something new out of him. A fighter. A name. A commodity with fame. But at night, when the pain throbbed and the others were asleep, Lucius held on to one thought. The school was able to teach him how to fight. She could show him how to fall, how to strike, how to look death in the eye. But she wouldn't decide who he was at heart. Not yet. Chapter 6. Training for Death. The body got used to a lot of things if you gave it no choice. In the beginning, Lucius had believed that pain was something that came, stayed, and eventually disappeared again. In Gladiator School, he learned that pain had many forms. There was the stabbing pain of a blow that suddenly went through the arm. The dull pain of tired muscles after an endless workout. The burning pain of chafed hands. The pulling pain of old injuries that awoke again in the morning before the first step. And then there was a pain that was deeper than any other, the certainty that every day prepared him for a fight in which he could die. The training started before sunrise. Even before Rome really woke up, the horn echoed through the corridors of the school. The men stood up, some cursing, some silent, some so tired that they didn't know where they were for a moment. Lucius had often believed in the first few days that his body could no longer do it. But every time he thought his strength was exhausted, he still found a remnant somewhere. Not out of courage, not out of hope, but because the overseer's whip did not accept fatigue. Varro, the lanista, or one of his instructors, was already waiting in the courtyard. The first exercises were always the same: running, carrying, lifting, jumping, ducking, getting up again. No sword, no glory, no dramatic battle. Just repetition. The instructor said that a man who could no longer breathe in combat was already dead. So they had to walk until their lungs burned. They had to lift heavy stones until their arms trembled. They had to hold shields until their shoulders burned like fire. Lucius hated these exercises more than the fights with wooden weapons. You could feel anger against an opponent. Not against a stone. Not against your own breath. Not against fatigue. But that was precisely the purpose. The school wanted to break the body and reassemble it. She wanted to turn wild movements into control, fear into obedience, and exhaustion into second nature. After the run came the basic training with the shield. Lucius had never understood how heavy a shield could be before. From the outside, it looked simple, a piece of wood, leather, and metal plus a handle. But after an hour, he became a burden who wanted to pull his arm down. The instructor walked along the rows and struck with a stick against every shield that sank too low. "The shield lives as long as you live," he shouted again and again. "If the shield falls, the man falls." Lucius learned that a shield was not only protection. He was a wall, a weapon, a tool. It could be used to absorb blows, push enemies away, cover lines of sight, prepare attacks. Those who held their shield incorrectly opened their own body. Those who held it too rigidly slowed down. Whoever held it too low offered neck and face. At first, Lucius thought too much. He tried to follow every instruction consciously. Foot forward, shield up, weight shifted, sword ready. But there was no time for that in the fight. An opponent did not wait for a man to sort out his thoughts. Therefore, they had to repeat the same movements, hundreds of times, thousands of times, until the body knew them before the mind spoke them. Step, cover, push, back, rotation, block, breathe. Don't blink. Don't hesitate. The wooden swords were heavier than real blades. Lucius had heard this explanation before, but it did not comfort him when his fingers became numb. Every day he hit the training pole. The stake had no face, no name, and no fear. He just stood there, anchored deep in the sand, taking every blow. The instructor wanted to see clear movements. No wild blows. No senseless force. Every blow had to have a purpose. "A nice blow that leaves you open is stupidity," Dama said one day as he watched Lucius. "A simple push that hits his life." Dama was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, the younger ones listened. He'd survived enough fights to know that the arena didn't reward stories, but punished mistakes. He showed Lucius how not to swing far with a short sword, but to strike narrowly and quickly. How to tie the opponent's arm. How to use an apparent retreat to lure him forward. How to keep your eyes steady even when your heart was racing. Lucius learned slowly. His body became stronger, but not only that. He became more alert. He noticed how he walked differently after a few weeks. Safer, quieter, with your knees slightly bent, ready to shift your weight. He observed people differently. Not her clothes, not her words, but her shoulders, her hands, her feet. There was an announcement in every movement. A person often revealed what he was going to do before he knew it. But the training did not only consist of weapons. The men had to wrestle because a fight rarely remained clean. A shield could be lost, a sword could be knocked out of the hand, an opponent could suddenly be too close. Then it was no longer the blade alone that decided, but balance, grip strength, and will. Lucius didn't like wrestling. It was cramped, brutal, and humiliating. You tasted dust, felt each other's breath on your face, struggled for air and control. Brennus was almost invincible in wrestling. His strength was enormous, but he was not clumsy. He knew how to use weight. When he grabbed a man, it felt like a stone door closing. The first time Lucius had to fight him, it took little more than a few breaths for him to lie on his back and press Brennus' forearm against his chest. "Dead," said the instructor. Lucius stared at the sky, panting. Once again. The second time he lasted a little longer. The third time, he learned not to push against Brenna's strength, but to avoid it. The fourth time, he managed to spin out of a hold before falling back to the ground. Small advances were not celebrated at school, but Lucius noticed them. And sometimes that was enough. Between the exercises, injuries were treated. Not gently, but thoroughly. The school had men who straightened bones, cleaned wounds, applied ointments and changed bandages. An injured gladiator was lost money, so care was taken not to break the fighters too soon. This care had nothing to do with compassion. This is precisely what made her so bitter. Lucius was given food, rest, and treatment so that he could die or win later in the arena. The food was simple but plentiful. Porridge, beans, barley, bread, sometimes cheese, rarely meat. The older gladiators said that this food made them heavy and strong. Lucius got used to it. He ate even when he wasn't hungry because he had learned that hunger turned into weakness in training. He drank when he was given water. He slept as soon as he could. His life was reduced to the needs of battle. But the hardest part of the training was not physical. It was the preparation for death. They didn't talk about it all the time at school, but he was always there. In every weapon, in every scar, in every look of a man who had survived a fight. New gladiators often made the mistake of imagining that they could simply ignore death. But the closer the first real fight came, the clearer it became that ignoring was not the same as overcoming. The instructors therefore let the men train under noise. Slaves beat shields, shouted, whistled, and threw up sand. Others had to watch and mock. Sometimes trumpets were blown while two fighters practiced. The reason was simple: there would be no silence in the arena. Those who could only fight in the quiet courtyard would lose control under the screams of the crowd. Lucius hated this noise. He reminded him that the fight would not only be between him and an opponent. Thousands would watch. Thousands would demand that he not only defend himself, but offer them something. A boring fight was dangerous. A victory that was too quick could disappoint the organizer. A fighter who was too timid lost the crowd. The arena was not only about survival, but also about how to survive. Cassian understood this better than any other volunteer. He trained not only movements, but effect. He knew when to raise a shield, when to take a step back, when to turn his head, as if he could hear the cheers in front of him. Lucius despised the spectacle at first, but Marcellus explained to him that a gladiator who understood the crowd sometimes had a better chance. "The crowd can't save you," Marcellus said, "but it can influence whether you are allowed to live." This sentence weighed heavily on Lucius' thoughts, because it made it clear that even a defeated man did not die only because of his defeat. He died when people wanted to see his death. He might have been alive if they found him brave. So the gladiators also trained posture. How to get up after a fall. How to hide pain. How not to make yourself small when you lost. A man who looked worthy could rather hope for mercy. A man who whined was despised. Lucius often wondered if this was courage or just another form of imprisonment. One afternoon he had to fight Dama, this time before everyone else. It was just a practice match, but Varro was watching. That alone changed everything. Lucius felt the men's eyes on him. His mouth was dry. Dama stood opposite him, calm as always. The fight began. Lucius held up better than before. He didn't attack blindly right away. He let Dama come, dodged, blocked, looked for an opening. Twice, Damas's wooden sword hit his shield so hard that Lucius' arm became numb, but he stopped. Then he saw a movement in Damas's shoulder. A push would come, deep to the side. Lucius spun, intercepted the attack, and delivered a quick blow to Damas's upper arm. It wasn't a decisive goal, but it was a hit. It became quiet in the courtyard for a moment. Then Dama nodded imperceptibly. Lucius felt something he hadn't felt for a long time: pride. But the moment did not last long. Dama took advantage of his brief inattention, kicked him in the leg and brought him down. Lucius landed hard in the sand. The wooden sword lay at his throat. "Dead," Damas said. This time the words sounded different. Not mockingly. Not cruel. Almost like an apprenticeship. Lucius remained lying and stared up. His goal had proven that he could learn. His fall had proven that learning was not enough. In the evening, he sat exhausted against the wall of the bedroom. His hands were torn open, his leg ached, and a dark bruise formed on his shoulder. Nevertheless, he did not feel defeated. For the first time, he had understood that training was not just to prepare him for the arena. It also gave him back something that Rome had taken from him, the ability not to be completely helpless. That made the matter dangerous. Because the better Lucius became, the closer the day came when he would really be used. Every progress was a step towards survival, and at the same time a step towards the arena. The school shaped him, but it did not do it to save him. She did it to make him more valuable. That night Lucius did not fall asleep for a long time. He heard the breathing of the other men. Brennus snored softly. Nicanor muttered in his sleep. Somewhere water dripped onto stone. Moonlight fell on the floor through a small window. Lucius looked at his hands. They had become harder. The skin was rough, the ankles swollen. They were no longer the hands of the boy who had once carried wood and broken bread in his village. They were hands that learned to wield a sword. He wondered if his mother would still have recognized him. Then he slowly closed his fingers into a fist. Training for death had begun to change him. But deep inside him remained the desire not only to train for death. He wanted to survive. He wanted to understand. One day he wanted to be more than a fighter whom Rome put in the sand. And while the city slept outside, Lucius swore to himself that every blow, every pain and every scar would not only serve Rome. They would also serve him. Because if the arena was waiting for him, he wouldn't meet it as a victim, but as a man who had learned to fight back. Chapter 7. The Different Gladiator Types. Lucius had believed that a gladiator was simply a man with a gun. In his first days at school, he had imagined the arena to be simple: 2 fighters, 2 swords, 1 fight, 1 winner. But the longer he trained, the more clearly he realized that the world of gladiators was much more complicated. Rome loved order, even in bloodshed. Nothing was left to chance. Not even the way men attacked each other. A gladiator was not just a gladiator. He had a role. These roles determined what weapons he carried, what armor protected him, how he moved, and who he was to fight against. Some were heavily armored and looked like walking walls. Others were light, fast, and dangerous like hunting animals. Some fought with sword and shield, others with net, trident, dagger, or lance. Each type had strengths. Everyone had weaknesses. And that's exactly where the spectacle that the audience loved so much came about. The instructors did not explain it to the newcomers out of friendliness. They had to know what kind of fighter they could become. A tall, strong man was used differently than a fast, slim one. A calm fighter was suitable for different weapons than a fierce attacker. The school was not looking for what a man wanted to be. She was looking for what could be made of his body and his character. Lucius understood this one morning when Varro had all the newcomers line up in the courtyard. In front of them, various weapons and pieces of armor lay on the ground. Helmets, shields, greaves, arm guards, short swords, long staffs, a trident, and even a folded net. The objects did not shine as in the hands of heroes. They seemed heavy, used, and deadly. Varro walked past it slowly. The audience doesn't want a fight between 2 equal men, he said. It wants opposites. Power versus speed. Protection against mobility. Attack against cunning. Anyone who understands that understands the arena. Then he raised a large rectangular shield. The Murmillo. An experienced gladiator stepped forward. He was broadly built, with strong legs and a calm gaze. A heavy helmet was put on him, along with an arm guard, a greave, a shorter sword and the large shield. When he was fully equipped, he looked like a piece of Roman battle order in the sand. Stable, dangerous, difficult to overcome. The Murmillo was a fighter who trusted in steadfastness. His shield covered a large part of the body. His sword was short, but deadly at the right moment. He didn't have to attack wildly. He could wait, block, make the opponent tired. Then, when a gap arose, he struck. Lucius looked at Brennus and knew immediately that the instructors could see such a fighter in him. Brennus had the strength to hold a heavy shield for a long time. He had the body to build up pressure. But Brennus grimaced when the helmet was shown. "You can hardly see anything in it," he murmured. Marcellus, who was standing next to it, answered dryly, "You don't have to see much either. Just enough not to die." Some men laughed softly. Then Varro pointed to another helmet, smaller and differently shaped, with a curved shield and a short sword. "The Thraex," he said. A fighter stepped forward, lighter than the Murmillo, but wiry. He wore high greaves and a small shield. His weapon was curved, suitable for getting past cover. The Thraex seemed more restless, faster, almost cunning. He couldn't just disappear behind a big sign. He had to move, look for angles, irritate and punish the opponent if he reacted too slowly. Lucius watched in fascination as the Thraex competed against the Murmillo in the practice battle. The difference was immediately visible. The Murmillo stood firm, pushed the shield forward and forced the opponent back. The Thraex dodged, pranced to the side, hit the leg, then the edge of the shield, then back again. For the spectators, such a fight had to be exciting. The heavy fighter like a fortress, the lighter one like a knife looking for a crack. "Not every enemy is defeated by hitting them harder," Damas said quietly next to Lucius. "Some are defeated by leaving them wrong." Lucius remembered that. Next, the Hoplomachus was introduced, a fighter reminiscent of Greek warriors. He carried a small round shield, a lance and a short sword for close combat. His greaves were high, his helmet heavy. With the lance he could keep his distance, test the opponent and force him to be careful. But if the lance was lost or the opponent came too close, he had to change quickly. Nicanor looked at Hoplomachus with a strange expression. Perhaps the equipment reminded him of stories from his homeland. Perhaps it pained him that Roman arenas turned even foreign warrior images into entertainment. In Rome, everything was recorded, reshaped and displayed. Then came the retiarius. At the sight of him, the mood in the courtyard changed. Some grinned. Others seemed serious. The retiarius wore hardly any armor. No heavy helmet, no big shield. His protection consisted mainly of an arm guard and a shoulder piece. His weapons were a net, a trident and a dagger. Next to the armored fighters, he seemed almost vulnerable. But when the demonstration fight began, Lucius understood why no one should underestimate him. The retiarius moved easily and quickly. He kept his distance, lured his opponent, did not throw the net immediately, but let it circle as if it were a threat. The trident kept the other at a distance. Every step of the opponent had to be considered. If he came too slowly, the retiarius could tire him out. If he came too fast, he could run into the net. And when the net hit, a seemingly unprotected fighter could suddenly make the difference between life and death. "A retiarius must be brave," said Marcellus. "Or crazy." Cassian smiled. "Sometimes it's the same thing." Lucius couldn't imagine standing almost unprotected in the arena. But he also felt the fascination of this guy. The retiarius was not a walking shield. It was movement, patience, and danger. The audience loved him because he looked so different, almost like a fisherman of death. His frequent opponent was the Secutor. This fighter was heavier armored, with a smooth helmet, small slit, shield and sword. His helmet was shaped in such a way that it was less easy for a net to get caught in it. The name suited him. He was the pursuer. Against retiarius, he had to put pressure on, shorten the gap, faced the fast opponent before his own air ran out. The retiarius wanted space. The secutor wanted closeness. This resulted in a fight that was easy for the audience to understand. Flight and hunting, cunning and pressure, net against blade. Lucius realized how exactly the pairings were planned. The fights should not only be deadly, but readable. The audience had to understand at a glance what the tension was. Who was heavier? Who was faster? Who had the advantage from afar? Who in hand-to-hand combat? A good fight told a story even before the first blow fell. There were other types. The provocator, with shield, chest armor and sword, often pitted against a similar opponent. The equites, who could start on horseback and thus resembled cavalry. The bestiarius, who had to fight animals and whose performances were particularly dangerous. Each guy had his own rules, his own expectations, his own possibilities to shine or die. Lucius listened attentively, but the more he learned, the clearer it became to him that this diversity was a mask. The different armors, weapons, and names gave the arena color. They turned violence into a game with roles. But under every helmet there was a person. A man whose breath went faster. A man who knew that a small mistake could be enough. A man who perhaps didn't hate the opponent, but the system that had put them both there. In the following weeks, the instructors tested the newcomers with different weapons. Brennus got the heavy shield and got used to it faster than he wanted to admit. His strength made him suitable for a role in which he could build up pressure and press the opponent with force. Nicanor was tested with smaller shields and more flexible exercises. He was not strong, but attentive. He saw patterns faster than others. Tigranes showed astonishing calmness with his lance. Cassian wanted to try everything and acted as if every weapon was made for him. Lucius himself was initially trained with sword and shield. Not with the biggest shield, but not easy either. The instructors watched him closely. He wasn't as strong as Brennus and not as playful as Cassian. But he was fast, capable of learning and tough. When he fell, he stood up. When he was hit, he became more cautious, not just angrier. That made him interesting. Dama said to him one day, "You are still fighting against yourself." Lucius wiped blood from his lip. "I thought I was fighting you." "No. You see me. Not you." Lucius didn't understand immediately, but little by little he understood what Dama meant. He carried his anger like an additional weapon, but sometimes it became too heavy for him. She let him attack too early, hit too hard, follow up too long. A gladiator type wasn't just equipment. It was also a way of thinking. The Murmillo needed patience. The Thraex needed angle and speed. The Retiarius needed nerves of iron. The Secutor needed perseverance and determination. Anyone who played a role not only had to wear it, but embody it. That frightened Lucius. Because if he grew too well into his role, what would be left of him? One evening he was allowed to put on a real gladiator helmet for the first time. It was heavier than he expected. When the helmet sank over his face, the world became narrow. The voices sounded muffled. The light fell only through narrow openings. He raised his shield, took the sword in his hand, and looked out at the training ground. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself anymore. He saw only the form of a fighter, a body with metal and leather, a man whom the audience might one day cheer on without really seeing his face. This armor protected him, but it also hid him. It made him stronger and at the same time took away something human from him. Marcellus stepped beside him. "Get used to it," he said. "In the arena, the first thing they see is the helmet, then the weapon. Only when you're good enough will they see the man underneath." Lucius breathed slowly. The helmet smelled of oil, iron, and old sweat. He thought of all the men who had worn such armor before him. Some had won. Others had fallen in the sand. Their names may have been whispered somewhere, but their bodies were long gone. Rome had made types out of them. Murmillo, Thraex, Retiarius, Secutor. But each of these names was only a shell. Lucius raised the sword and felt the weight in his hand. The school wanted to find out which role suited him. The arena wanted to make him an image that the crowd understood. Varro wanted to form a fighter who would bring profit. The audience wanted excitement, blood, and courage. But Lucius wanted something else. He wanted to learn to use every role without letting himself be completely devoured by it. He wanted to understand how the various fighters thought so that he could hold his own against them. He wanted to know where the heavy shield slowed down, when the fast fighter got tired, how to escape a net, and how to let a pursuer run into the void. Because in the arena, it wouldn't be enough to be strong. You had to be able to read what was in front of you. A shield was not just a shield. A helmet, not just a helmet. A weapon, not just a weapon. Everything told something about the person who wore them, about his possibilities and his dangers. And Lucius began to understand. Anyone who understood the different types of gladiators understood the language of the arena. A language of metal, sand, and blood. A language he had to learn if he wanted to survive. Chapter 8. Life Behind the Walls. Behind the walls of the Gladiator School there were no seasons. At least that's how it felt to Lucius. Outside, Rome might shimmer under the heat in summer or shine with cold rain in winter, but inside the ludus everything remained the same. The horn in the morning, the dust in the courtyard, the smell of oil and sweat, the harsh voices of the instructors, the footsteps of the guards on the walls. Every day was similar to the last, and yet every day could change everything. The life of a gladiator was not just about fighting. Lucius understood this little by little. The arena was the highlight, the moment that everything was leading towards, but most of the time the men spent not in front of cheering spectators, but in the confines of the school. Here they were awakened, trained, fed, treated, observed, and punished. Here they sometimes laughed, argued, were silent, dreamed, and were afraid. The world behind the walls was smaller than Rome, but for Lucius it soon became bigger than anything else, because every breath was determined by it. The day always started the same. Before sunrise, the horn roused the men from their sleep. Some jumped up immediately because they had learned that hesitation brought pain. Others needed a moment to move their bodies, especially if the previous day's training had left its mark. Lucius knew by now the feeling of waking up with stiff legs and burning shoulders. He knew the brief seconds of confusion when he thought he was back in his old home before the smell of the bedroom brought him back. Stein, sweat, breath, imprisoned men. Then followed the washing, concisely and without comfort. Cold water from clay jugs, sometimes a quick walk to the washing places if the guards allowed it. Then food, porridge made from barley or beans, bread, water, sometimes cheese or a little oil. The food was simple but regular. That was more than many poor people in Rome could expect. This thought did not make Lucius' meal any more pleasant. He knew why they were fed. Not because they were human beings, but because they were needed. A weak gladiator was worthless. After the meal, the training began, but between the hard exercises there were moments that outsiders would hardly have expected. Weapons were maintained. Checked straps on shields. Helmets oiled. Sand knocked out of leather cracks. Bandages. Body so that muscles do not harden completely. School was a machine, and every man was a part of it. If a part rusted, it was repaired. When it could no longer be repaired, it was replaced. This realization settled like dust on everything. Nevertheless, a kind of everyday life developed in this place. Humans can develop habits even in captivity. Brennus almost always sat in the same place when he ate, with his back to the wall. Nicanor collected small wax tablet remnants when he found them and carved signs into them. Tigranes prayed quietly every night, always towards a corner of the room, as if there was something there that only he could see. Cassian told stories when he felt like it, and was offended when no one laughed. Lucius had initially believed that every man at school was only concerned with himself. In a way, that was true. Everyone carried their own fear, their own hunger for survival, their own memories. But over time, he realized that people who suffer together cannot remain complete strangers. You didn't have to be friends to look out for each other. You didn't have to like each other to know when someone was about to break down. Once Lucius saw Nicanor almost faint while training with a shield. The Greek had not shown any signs of it, but his movements slowed down, his lips pale. The instructor did not notice it immediately, or did not want to notice it. Brenna stepped next to him, nudged him roughly with his shoulder and growled, "Stand right." Nicanor blinked confusedly. "Breathe," Brenna said more quietly. "Through the nose. Don't fall." From the outside, it would have seemed like harshness. In truth, Brennus had saved him. If Nicanor had fallen, the instructor would have mocked him as weak or worse punished him. So he persevered until the exercise ended. Later, he didn't say thank you. Brennus did not expect it. Such things happened often. One man handed water to another without looking at him. One pulled a bandage tighter when the injured man's fingers trembled. One warned a new instructor about a trainer who struck particularly quickly. Small gestures, barely visible, but at school they meant a lot. They reminded Lucius that Rome could try to weaponize them, but they were still human. But closeness was dangerous. Any man who sat next to you today could be in the arena tomorrow. Maybe not as an opponent, maybe just in another fight, but death was never far away. That's why many kept their distance. Too much friendship made you vulnerable. Anyone who knew a person no longer saw just a fighter, but a face, a voice, a story. And stories made farewells more difficult. Marcellus seemed to understand this better than anyone else. He was friendly in a terse, cautious way, but he didn't let anyone get too close to him. Lucius noticed it by the boundaries drawn by the elder gladiator. He gave advice, helped in training, explained mistakes. But when conversations became more personal, he changed the subject or stood up. One evening, Lucius asked him, "Did you have family outside?" Marcellus looked out into the courtyard for a long time. The sun had already disappeared behind the wall, and the sand lay in the blue shadow. "Everyone had something outside," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that's useful." Lucius was silent. He did not immediately understand the harshness in this answer, but later he understood it better. Those who talked too much about what was lost opened a door through which pain entered. Some men could live with this pain. Others were destroyed by it. The school also had its own rules among the gladiators. Not all of them were written, but everyone learned them. No food was stolen from anyone. No man was ridiculed immediately before his first fight. No one was attacked in their sleep. You didn't intentionally put a comrade's life in danger during training, unless you wanted to end up with a knife in your back later. Nevertheless, there was a dispute. Men who were imprisoned, tired and full of fear, always found reasons for anger. Sometimes a wrong look was enough. Once, Cassian and a convicted fighter named Rufus clashed. Rufus was brutal, a man with thick arms and a voice like a broken stone. He didn't like Cassian's smile, and Cassian couldn't help but tease him. At dinner, Cassian said something about men who only seemed strong because thinking was too hard for them. Some laughed. Rufus doesn't. He stood up, grabbed Cassian by the collar and pushed him against the wall. For a moment, Lucius thought Rufus was going to kill him. But before that could happen, Dama intervened. Not loud, not hectic. He just stood next to her and said, "Not here." Rufus glared at him. "Go away." Dama didn't move. "Not here." It was not a request. Rufus let go of Cassian. Maybe because he respected Dama. Perhaps because he knew that fighting outside the rules could bring punishment for everyone. Cassian rubbed his neck and was silent for the first time in a long time. Lucius learned from this that power in school had many forms. Varro had official power. The instructors owned the sticks. The guards owned the gates. But among the gladiators, Those who had survived had influence. Men like Dama or Marcellus didn't need to scream. Her scars spoke for her. On some days, visitors came to the school. Rich Romans, organizers, sometimes messengers of an important man. Then the air changed. The gladiators had to compete or be paraded. They practiced certain movements, showed strength, discipline, and endurance. It was humiliating, but different from the slave market. Here they were not considered raw goods, but polished goods. That didn't make it much better. Lucius hated these visits. He hated the looks of the men who scrutinized his arms, his gait, his posture. He hated it when they talked about possible pairings, as if they were arranging pieces on a board. Once he heard a visitor say, "The boy has a good face. The audience likes young fighters when they seem tough." The boy. Lucius would have liked to yell at him that he had a name. Instead, he stood still, because standing still was sometimes the only form of resistance that did not bring punishment. But life behind the walls was not all humiliation. There were also brief moments when something like humanity penetrated through the cracks. On a rainy day, it was not possible to train as usual. The courtyard was muddy, and water ran down the walls in thin streams. The men sat under a covered corridor and waited for orders. Cassian began to tell an exaggerated story about a gladiator who was supposedly so beautiful that the women of Rome fainted at the sight of him. Brennus growled that this story was not possibly true. Nicanor said dryly that the gladiator was probably only beautiful because no one had seen him without a helmet. For the first time in a long time, Lucius laughed out loud. It surprised even him. The laughter didn't last long, but it was real. For a moment, they were not just prisoners, fighters, or possessions. They were men who sat in the rain and heard a stupid story. This moment quickly disappeared, but Lucius kept it inside him like a small treasure. Such moments make life more bearable and at the same time more painful, because they reminded us of what would have been possible if the world had been different. Brennus might have been a good neighbor. Nicanor is a teacher. Cassian an actor or merchant. Dama a quiet craftsman. Marcellus a father who taught his son how to split wood or mend nets. Instead, they were prepared to fight before the eyes of Rome. In the evening, when the training ended, the school slowly became quieter. The men cleansed themselves, ate, treated wounds. Then came the short time before sleep, which Lucius feared most and at the same time needed the most. Then the thoughts became loud. In the exertion of the day, he was able to suppress a lot. In the darkness it returned. His village. His mother. His brother. The question of whether they were still alive. The question of whether he lost himself. Sometimes he heard other men crying, very quietly, hoping that no one would notice. No one spoke to her about it. Not out of coldness, but out of respect. Everyone had nights when the walls got tighter and the next day seemed too hard. On such nights, Lucius lay awake and looked at the narrow strip of moonlight on the ground. He thought of the walls of the school. They were supposed to lock up men. But they didn't just keep the gladiators inside. They also kept the world out. Behind them was Rome with its markets, temples, houses, and people walking freely through the streets. Inside there was a different order. An order that fed the body and starved the soul. An order that allowed camaraderie, but made hope dangerous. Nevertheless, Lucius found something behind these walls that he had not expected. He did not find freedom, not peace, not security, but he found people who, despite everything, were not completely broken. Brennus with his rough care, Nicanor with his sharp mind, Tigranes with his silent prayers, Cassian with his annoying smile, Dama with his calm strength, Marcellus with his concise truths. They were all part of this world, and yet they proved that Rome could not control everything. It could arrange their days. It could train their bodies. It could plan their fights. But it couldn't fully determine what was going on between them when no spectator was looking. Lucius realized that life behind the walls was not just preparation for death. It was also a constant, quiet struggle to remain human. Every shared sip of water, every secret laugh, every advice in training, every silence at the right moment was a small resistance against a world that wanted to turn them into weapons. And perhaps, Lucius thought, freedom didn't just begin with an open gate. Perhaps it began where one person refused to become the property of another inwardly. That night he fell asleep with this thought. The walls were still standing. The guards were still doing their rounds. The arena was still waiting. But deep inside Lucius, something had grown that was stronger than the day he arrived. No loud courage, no sure plan, no certainty. Only a quiet decision. He would survive. And he would remember that even behind walls a man could be more than what Rome wanted him to be. Chapter 9. Friendship Among Enemies. In Gladiator School, friendship was a dangerous word. It didn't fit the walls, not the weapons, not the orders of the instructors. Friendship belonged to free people, to shared meals without fear, to families, neighbors, and memories of a life that had long since been taken from men in the ludus. Here, no one should be too attached to someone else. Here, every name, every laugh, and every familiar face could end in the sand one day. And yet friendship arose precisely where it seemed least allowed. Lucius didn't notice it immediately. At first, the others had only been fellow prisoners for him. Men who ate next to him trained, sweated, and suffered. Some he liked, others he didn't. Some he feared. Some he barely understood. But after weeks and months, the boundaries shifted. Strangers became acquaintances. Acquaintances became comrades. And comrades became people whose pain he was no longer indifferent to. That made everything more complicated. Because in the arena, pity was a risk. Marcellus had often told him, "Don't see too much of yourself in your opponent. Otherwise your hand will hesitate." Lucius had understood this sentence, but he hated it. Because how could he not see too much? How could he forget that Brennus sometimes talked about his children at night? How could he see Nicanor as a body if he knew that he was better with words than some Roman scholars? How could he despise Cassian when behind his ridicule lay a deep fear of insignificance? The more Lucius knew about the others, the harder it became to accept the simple truth of the arena. Survival could mean someone else died. The first person Lucius really trusted was Nicanor. The Greek was not physically the strongest in school, and at first many had underestimated him. But he had a different kind of strength. He observed, thought, and memorized things that others missed. He knew which instructor was particularly irritated on which days. He recognized when a training partner was getting tired, even before his movements seemed slower. He could read from a glance whether a man was looking for a fight or just hiding his fear. Lucius liked his calm manner. One evening, after training, they sat next to each other on the wall of the courtyard. The sun had already set, but the stone had stored its heat. Lucius rubbed his knuckles, which had been knocked open by the wooden sword. Nicanor held a small wax tablet in his hands and scratched signs into it with a broken pen. "What are you writing?" Lucius asked. Nicanor hesitated for a moment. Then he turned the board slightly. "Names." Lucius recognized some letters, but not all. "By whom?" "From those who were here." Lucius looked at him. "Why?" Nicanor was silent for a moment. "Because Rome makes men disappear. I don't want everyone to disappear." This answer struck Lucius deeper than he had expected. At school, men sometimes didn't even die in the arena. Some were taken away after serious injuries. Some disappeared to other schools after fighting. Some were sold when they no longer promised a profit. Their names hung briefly in the bedroom like smoke, then they dissolved. Nicanor wrote them down. It was a small deed, senseless perhaps, considering the greatness of Rome. But for Lucius it was important. It meant that someone refused to regard the dead as only lost goods. That someone said, "This man was here." He was breathing. He had a name. From that evening on, Lucius spoke to Nicanor more often. The Greek didn't talk much about his family, but sometimes he mentioned the sea he had seen as a child, the voices in markets, his father's scrolls. Lucius said little about his village, but Nicanor did not press. Friendship at school often did not consist of many words. Sometimes it consisted of knowing when to be silent. Brennus was different. He was difficult to reach, a man of rock and silence. Many thought he was rude, and he was. He spoke briefly, laughed rarely, and looked at new men as if he were wondering how long they would survive. But Lucius had long since noticed that Brennus perceived more than he showed. If a younger fighter took too little while eating, Brennus would sometimes give him a piece of bread without a word. If someone was wrong in training, he growled a warning before the instructor struck. One day, Brennus saved Lucius from a serious injury. They practiced pairings between heavy shield and lighter fighter. Lucius was exhausted, but too proud to show it. His opponent was Rufus, the convicted fighter who had already attracted attention several times by his exaggerated harshness. Actually, they were supposed to train with controlled strokes. But Rufus rarely kept to boundaries when he thought no one would punish him for it. Lucius blocked an attack, backed away and felt his foot slip away in a loose patch of sand. Rufus saw the weakness immediately. Instead of stopping the blow, he swung out, hard and deep, directly against Lucius' knee. It wouldn't have been a fatal hit, but one that might have made him unable to train for weeks. Before the blow hit, Brennus' wooden shield crashed in between. The impact was so violent that Rufus stumbled back. For a moment the courtyard was silent. Brennus stood between them, as wide as a wall. "Exercise," he said in a dark voice. "Not execution." Rufus grimaced. "Get out of the way." Brennus took a step closer. "Try to move." The instructor ended the dispute before it escalated. Rufus was yelled at, Brennus as well, because he had interrupted the exercise. Both had to run additional laps. But when Brennus walked past Lucius later, he said nothing. He didn't expect any thanks. Lucius said it anyway. Brennus stopped without looking at him. "You were in a bad position." "I know. Then you'd better stand next time." That was all. But from that day on, Lucius knew that Brennus didn't see him as just another man in the bedroom. Cassian was more difficult. Cassian could be unbearable. He spoke too much, smiled too often, and turned even serious moments into mockery. He acted as if the arena was a stage on which he was just waiting for his big performance. Many considered it superficial. Lucius too. But the longer he knew him, the more clearly he saw the cracks in this mask. At night, when Cassian thought no one heard him, he slept restlessly. Sometimes he mumbled names. Once Lucius woke up and saw him sitting upright on his bed, his face in his hands. The next morning, Cassian was back to his old self, loud, mocking, and self-assured. But Lucius had seen the other Cassian. A few days later, he asked him, "Who do you always play for?" Cassian grinned. "In front of my audience." "There is no audience here." The grin remained, but his eyes grew colder. "Yes. Always." Lucius didn't understand what Cassian meant until later. In a world where men were constantly judged, at some point you trained not only with a sword, but also with your own face. Don't show fear. Don't show weakness. Better to laugh than to tremble. Better to mock than to plead. Cassian's lightness was not freedom. It was armor. And perhaps Lucius' silence was also armor. The friendship between them did not come about through grand gestures, but through many small frictions. Cassian gave Lucius unsolicited tips on how to win over the crowd. Lucius called him a fool. Cassian laughed and said that fools often live longer because no one takes them seriously enough. Lucius later helped him attach an ill-fitting arm guard. Cassian didn't thank him, but the next day he put an extra piece of bread in front of Lucius at dinner and claimed that he didn't like it anyway. This is how closeness worked in Ludus. She came in disguise. As a mockery. As silence. As rough advice. As shared bread. But with the proximity, fear also grew. This fear got a face when the news came that in a few weeks several fighters from the school were to perform at public games. Names have not yet been named, but everyone knew that preparations had begun. The instructors became stricter. Varro observed more often. Visitors came more often. Weapons were examined, matings discussed, bodies examined. The mood changed. Men who used to laugh became quieter. Others trained harder, almost desperately. Still others sought arguments, because anger was easier to bear than fear. Lucius felt something invisible slip between the gladiators. Everyone knew, soon some of them would be selected. Not all of them would return. One evening, Lucius, Nicanor, Brennus, and Cassian were sitting in the bedroom. Outside a torch burned and cast restless shadows on the wall. No one spoke for long. Finally, Nicanor said, "If one of us falls, I'll write down his name." Cassian leaned back. "How comforting. So I will not die in vain, but will be scratched into your little tablet." Nicanor looked at him calmly. "It's more than Rome would do for you." Cassian opened his mouth, closed it again, and was silent. Brennus said quietly, "In my homeland, the names of the dead were spoken by the fire." Lucius looked at him. Brennus rarely spoke of his homeland. "So that they can find their way back?" asked Nicanor. Brennus shook his head. "So that the living know who they are." These words stuck in the room. Lucius thought of how Rome treated its prisoners. It tore them from their countries, gave them new roles, new weapons, sometimes new names. It made them Myrmillo, Thraex, Retiarius, or Secutor. It wanted the spectators to see the helmet, not the person. Maybe that's why remembrance was so important. Anyone who remembered contradicted Rome. Whoever kept the name of another said, "You were more than your death." That night, Lucius made a decision. "If one of you falls," he said slowly, "I will remember." Cassian looked at him. "And if you fall?" Lucius didn't answer immediately. Then Nicanor said, "Then we remember." It was not a solemn oath. No ceremony, no blood, no raised hands. Only 4 men in a dark room, trapped behind walls, tired of training and threatened by a future that none of them controlled. But for Lucius, it felt like something real. Perhaps friendship in Gladiator School was so strong precisely because it promised no security. Outside, friends could grow old together, cultivate fields, trade, start families. Here they could only help each other by another day. A piece of advice, a look, a piece of bread, an embossed name. More was often not possible. But sometimes that was just enough not to break inside. The next morning they trained again as before. The instructors screamed, wooden swords cracked, sand stuck to sweating bodies. Lucius fought Brennus and was pushed to the ground twice. Cassian laughed about it until Lucius pushed him against the stake later in the practice fight. Nicanor observed and gave both of them a clever remark without being asked, which insulted them and helped them at the same time. For a moment, the school felt almost alive. Not good. Not free. But alive. Then the gate to the courtyard opened, and Varro entered. Next to him walked a man in fine clothes. An organizer. Maybe a messenger. Maybe someone who picked fighters for the upcoming games. The conversations fell silent. Every gladiator straightened up. Everyone knew what this visit could mean. Lucius felt the friendship that had just given warmth suddenly become heavy. Because if the men were selected, they would not compete together against Rome. Rome would take them individually. It would test them, mate them, show them off, and perhaps set them against each other. The arena turned comrades into opponents when it served the spectacle. The finely dressed man walked past the rows. His gaze lingered on Brennus for a moment. Then Cassian. Then on Lucius. Lucius stood still. Inside, however, something contracted. He thought of Nicanor's wax tablet, of Brennus' words about fire, of Cassian's mask, Marcellus' warning not to see too much of himself in the opponent. Perhaps Marcellus was right. Perhaps friendship was dangerous in this world. But when Lucius felt the men next to him, their closeness, their fear and their silent determination, he also knew, without them, he would have become less than a person long ago. Rome had wanted to make them enemies. But behind the walls, in the shadow of the arena, they had become something else. Not free, not sure, but connected. And sometimes a bond between prisoners was stronger than the chains they wore. Chapter 10. The great battle is announced. The news did not come with trumpets. She came on an ordinary morning, between dust, sweat, and the dull blows of wooden swords. That is precisely why it seemed all the more threatening. It had not been a special day. No feast day, no visit from the emperor, no sign of the gods in the sky. The sun was pale over the walls of the Gladiator School, and Lucius had already struck the pole so many practice blows that his shoulders were burning. Then Varro stepped into the courtyard. Everyone noticed it immediately. The lanista rarely came out for no reason during training. When he appeared, the air changed. The instructors became more attentive, the guards straightened up, and even the experienced gladiators interrupted their movements, not out of obedience alone, but out of instinct. Varro was not a man who wasted time. When he spoke, it meant something. Next to him walked the same finely dressed man who had inspected the fighters a few days earlier. His toga was clean, his hands soft, his gaze scrutinizing. He looked out of place among all the dust and scarred bodies, and yet he moved with the certainty of a man who knew others were making room for him. Behind him followed a scribe with wax tablets. The training fell silent. Only a wooden sword fell to the ground somewhere. The sound was short and hard. Varro let his gaze wander over the men. He didn't enjoy such moments openly, but Lucius thought he saw something in his face: contentment. Not joy, but rather the cool certainty of a trader who had prepared his goods well. In 10 days, Varro said, matches in honor of victory will be held in the eastern province. A soft murmur went through the row of gladiators. 10 days. That wasn't a lot of time. For spectators, 10 days of anticipation meant anticipation. For gladiators, they meant sleepless nights. Varro waited until peace reigned again. Our school will provide fighters. No one moved. Lucius felt his fingers close around the hilt of the wooden sword. He had known that this moment would come. Every man at school knew it. You didn't train endlessly without being used at some point. And yet a part of him had hoped that time would stretch. 1 more week. 1 month to go. A little longer before possibility became reality. Varro began to name names. First the name of an experienced fighter was mentioned, then a second. Men who had already stood in the arena several times. They hardly reacted. One of them just nodded. Another closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were inwardly examining something that no one else could see. Then Varro named Brennus. Lucius didn't turn his head, but he felt the tall man next to him take a deeper breath. Brennus took half a step forward. No protest. No visible horror. Only this one step, difficult and final. Then Cassian. Cassian smiled immediately, much too fast, much too broad. Finally, he murmured, just loud enough for Lucius to hear. But his hand trembled slightly before he hid it behind his back. Other names followed. Nicanor was not named. Lucius didn't know if he should be relieved. Part of him was grateful. Another part was ashamed of this gratitude, because every name that was not mentioned only meant that someone else went in its place. Then came a short pause. Varro looked at the scribe's blackboard, although Lucius was sure that he had already known the names by heart. Lucius. The courtyard became quieter, although it had already been quiet. For a moment, Lucius felt nothing. Not fear, not anger, not surprise. Only emptiness. His name hung in the air, pronounced by a man who had bought, tested, and molded him. A single word, and yet it separated his life into a before and an after. He stepped forward. His legs obeyed, although he barely felt them. Varro looked at him. "You're going to fight." Lucius said nothing. What should he have said? "No, I'm not ready. I want to live." Such words had no place in this court. The fight was not a plea. It was decided. The finely dressed man leaned over to the clerk and whispered something. The clerk carved signs into the tablet. Maybe Lucius' name. Maybe his equipment. Perhaps its value. Varro continued. "The pairings will be determined in the next few days. Until then, you train according to a special plan. No unnecessary injuries. No disputes. Anyone who damages himself or makes another unusable will be punished." This was the end of the announcement. It's that simple. No music, no solemn words about honor, no explanation of why these men were chosen. Only names. Decisions. Orders. The training continued, but nothing was the same as before. Lucius raised his wooden sword, but the hilt felt strange. The stake in front of him blurred just before his eyes. 10 days. In 10 days he would no longer hit wood. In 10 days, a man would stand before him who would fight back, not to improve him, but to defeat him. Maybe to kill. Dama noticed his restlessness immediately. He stepped next to him and said, "Strike." Lucius did. Once again. He struck again. "You're thinking too far ahead." "How far should I think?" Lucius asked bitterly. "Until the next breath." Lucius wanted to object, but Dama didn't give him time. He forced him through exercises, simple movements, again and again. Block, step, push. Block, step, push. At first, Lucius was unfocused. Twice Dama hit him hard with the wooden sword, once on the shoulder, once on the ribs. The pain brought him back into his body. "The arena doesn't start in 10 days, Dama said. It starts now. In your head." These words accompanied Lucius through the rest of the day. After the announcement, the school changed. The selected fighters received other exercises. Their weapons were adjusted more precisely, their armor checked. Doctors looked at old injuries, rubbed ointments, applied bandages, checked teeth, eyes, and joints. Everything seemed almost caring, but Lucius knew that this care had only one purpose: they should be able to fight. Brennus trained with a heavy shield. It had been decided that he should appear as Murmillo. It suited him. His broad figure, his strength, his ability to build up pressure. When he raised the shield and advanced slowly, it looked as if a wall was moving across the sand. But Lucius noticed that Brennus was silent longer than usual after each exercise. Cassian has been prepared for a more agile role. He visibly enjoyed the attention of the instructors and made a small demonstration out of every turn, every lunge. But Lucius saw what others might have overlooked. Cassian practiced longer than usual in the evening. When no one was looking, he repeated the same movement 10, 20, 30 times. His smile was for the others. His repetitions were for fear. Lucius himself was given a sword and shield, an equipment that was familiar to him, but now looked more serious. The practice shield was exchanged for a real one. The weight was different. The edges were harder. The sword he was shown was not yet sharpened, but it shone enough to remind him of the purpose. In his hand, it didn't feel like a tool. It felt like a question. Can you kill if you have to? This question haunted him. In the evening, Lucius sat with Nicanor in the bedroom. The Greek had his wax tablet on his knees, but did not write. That was unusual. Lucius knew that Nicanor was looking for words and couldn't find any. "You're relieved," Lucius finally said. Nicanor looked up. "Yes." The honesty surprised him. "And I'm ashamed of it," Nicanor added. Lucius leaned his head against the wall. "If I were in your place, I would also be relieved." "That doesn't make it any better." "Yes," Lucius said quietly. "A little." Nicanor was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not going to write your name." Lucius looked at him. "Not before," Nicanor explained. "Not like you're dead already." These words hit Lucius harder than any comforting lie. He just nodded. Later Brennus joined them. He sat down heavily on his bed and looked at his hands. Cassian followed shortly after, still with a grin on his face, but quieter than usual. For a while, no one said anything. Between them lay the announcement like a fifth person. Finally, Cassian broke the silence. "When I die, I want you to say that I fell extraordinarily beautifully." Brennus snorted. "If you die, I'll say you were too loud." "It's almost the same." Nicanor twisted his mouth, barely visible. Lucius had to smile despite everything. The smile hurt, but it was real. Then Cassian became more serious. "Are you afraid?" No one answered immediately. Brennus finally said, "Yes." The simple word changed the room. Brennus, the tall, taciturn man who looked like rock, had said it. No excuse. No shame. Only truth. Cassian let his grin drop. "Me too." Nicanor looked at the wax tablet. "I'm scared, even though I don't have to fight." Lucius exhaled slowly. "Then at least we're not fools." Brennus looked at him. "Yes. But living fools." For a moment they laughed softly. Afterwards, Brennus told of a custom from his homeland. Before a fight, he said, men would sometimes say the names of their families, not out loud in front of everyone, but for themselves, so that they knew who they stood for when fear came. Cassian claimed he would give his own name because he missed himself the most. Nicanor said dryly that this was the most credible thing Cassian had ever said. Lucius said nothing. But names formed inside. His mother. His brother. The name of his village. Things that Rome did not know and could not pronounce. Maybe he would need her in the arena. Maybe he would whisper it before the gate opened. In the following days, the announcement was spread throughout the city. You could even hear it at school. Slaves and traders brought rumors with them. The games were called in public places. Names of famous fighters were mentioned. Animal hunts, executions, and gladiator fights were to take place. For Rome it was a feast. For Lucius, it was a clock whose hands moved inexorably. Sometimes he imagined the people talking about the upcoming games. A merchant who prepared his goods. A father who promised his son to take him with him. Young men making bets. Women whispering about particularly well-known gladiators. For them, the day was an event. A conversation. A change. None of them thought about the fact that at school men lay awake at night and waited for the same day as for a verdict. The closer the fight came, the sharper Lucius' senses became. He heard the grinding of metal louder. He felt the weight of the shield more clearly. He smelled oil, leather, and sand more intensely than before. Everything became meaningful. An incorrectly fitting strap. A small blister on the hand. A dream from which he woke up wet with sweat. His life was limited to preparation. Marcellus spoke little to him during this time. Lucius wondered if the older gladiator kept his distance because he didn't want to feel too much. But on the third evening before the games, Marcellus sat down next to him. "You'll be scared when you see the goal," he said. Lucius nodded. "I know that." "No. You think you know. It's different." Lucius was silent. "The crowd will be bigger than anything you imagine. Your helmet will look too tight. Your shield too heavy. You'll think everyone sees your fear. And if that's the case..." Marcellus looked at him calmly. "Then stand anyway." These words were simple, but they remained. Then Marcellus put something in his hand. It was a small leather strap, old and soft from use. "For the hilt of your sword," he said, "against sweat." Lucius looked at the strap. "Why are you giving me this?" Marcellus rose. "Because someone once gave me one." He said no more. On the last evening before the transport to the arena, hardly anyone slept. The selected fighters lay on their beds, got up again, sat down, drank water, checked straps, remained silent. Cassian didn't tell any more jokes. Brennus didn't pray, but he mumbled names in a language Lucius didn't understand. Nicanor sat awake with his blackboard, without writing. Lucius wrapped the leather strap around the hilt of his sword. Slowly, carefully, as if this small action was something he could control, while everything else had long since been decided. Then he thought of the question that had haunted him since the announcement. Can you kill if you have to? He still had no answer. But perhaps the more important question was another. Can you live when Rome awaits your death? Lucius put the sword next to him and closed his eyes. Sleep hardly came, only short dark waves, interrupted by sounds, breaths and thoughts. Sometime before dawn, the horn was not yet blown, but everyone knew that the day had begun. The big fight was no longer announced. He was there. And when Lucius got up, he felt the fear inside him like a cold stone. But something else was burning underneath. Not hope. Not security. A decision. He would see the goal. He would hear the crowd. He would step on the sand. And he would stand. Chapter 11. The Colosseum awakens. Even before the sun rose over Rome, the city was already awake. Lucius heard it long before he saw the Colosseum. The distant rolling of wagon wheels, the shouting of merchants, the barking of dogs, the babble of voices of people moving through the streets. On ordinary days, Rome sounded loud. This morning, however, the city sounded different. More excited. Greedier. As if she herself had hardly been able to sleep and was now impatiently waiting for the gates of the great amphitheater to open. The gladiators were led out of the school in the semi-darkness. Nobody spoke much. Guards accompanied them, armed and attentive. The selected fighters walked in a row, not in chains like ordinary prisoners, but also not freely. Their steps were orderly, their paths determined. Lucius wore simple clothes. His equipment was transported separately. Nevertheless, he already felt the weight of shield and sword as if they were already in his hands. Brennus walked a few steps in front of him. His broad back looked strong as always, but Lucius noticed how tense his shoulders were. Cassian ran behind him, his chin raised as if he were marching to a party, not a fight. But his silence betrayed more than any trembling. Marcellus was also with them, calm and almost unmoved. He had already experienced many such mornings. Maybe that was exactly the frightening thing. Rome was filled with people. Groups poured out of side streets onto the larger streets. Some carried baskets of food, others small cushions, jugs or cloths against the sun. Children ran ahead excitedly and were called back by their parents. Merchants set up stalls or carried their goods directly through the crowd. It smelled of fresh bread, roasted meat, smoke, wine, dust and sewage. Everything mingled with this heavy breath of Rome, which Lucius knew by now and yet could never endure. Many people went in the same direction, to the Colosseum. For them, this morning was a promise. A day off full of excitement. They would look for seats, meet acquaintances, eat, drink, bet, laugh and shout. They would talk about special fighters, about animals from distant countries, about the generosity of the organizer and about the question of who would show courage in the arena. Some hoped for blood. Others may have claimed that they came for the art of fighting. In the end, however, everyone wanted to see how close a person could get to death without putting them in danger themselves. Lucius looked into their faces. Some noticed the gladiators and pointed at them. One boy tried to catch a better look until his mother pulled him back. An old man nodded appreciatively, as if he recognized Brennus as a strong fighter. Two young men looked at Cassian and whispered. Maybe they made a bet. Perhaps they were wondering whether this smiling fighter would die or win. No one looked at Lucius the way a man should look at another man. They saw a possibility. Entertainment. Danger. Maybe fame. The Colosseum finally rose before them, mighty and bright in the first light of day. Lucius had seen it from a distance, but up close it seemed almost impossible. Stone upon stone, arch upon arch, floors that towered into the sky. It wasn't just a building. It was an explanation. Rome could not only conquer cities and build roads. Rome was also able to create a place where tens of thousands came together to see what power looked like when it turned into sand, blood, and jubilation. The amphitheater swallowed the crowd through its many entrances. People poured into it like water into a huge well. The ranks inside filled up according to order. The powerful took the best seats, close to the action. The ordinary citizens sat further up. Women, the poor and strangers were pushed into more distant areas. Even when watching, Rome remained a city of rank. Everyone had their place, even in the cheers. The gladiators were not led through the large entrances through which the people streamed. Their path led deeper sideways, through passages where the light grew dimmer and the noise from outside beat muffled against the walls. Lucius immediately felt the difference. Outside was the city. This is where the belly of the Colosseum began. The air was cooler, but heavier. Under the amphitheater were corridors, chambers, cages, and rooms full of sounds. Slaves walked by with tools and ropes. Guards gave orders. Animals roared out of the darkness, deep and strange. Somewhere metal struck metal. Men dragged stage parts, weapons, baskets, water jugs. Everything was movement, preparation, tension. Later, the spectators would only see what happened in the light of the arena. But a whole invisible world was working underneath so that death could occur on time. Lucius was taken to a preparation room with the others. Her equipment was waiting there. His sign was on the wall. The sword lay beside it, the hilt wrapped in the leather strap Marcellus had given him. Lucius touched him briefly, almost like a sign. The weapon was now sharpened. No more wood. No more practice. The blade caught the faint light of an oil lamp and threw it back coldly. A servant helped him put on the equipment. Arm protection. Belt. Leg splint. Straps. Every knot was checked, every clasp tightened. The movements were routine. For the servant, Lucius was just one of many fighters who were prepared that day. For Lucius, every touch was a step closer to the arena. When the helmet was in front of him, he hesitated. He thought of Marcellus' words, "You will be afraid when you see the gate." He didn't see the goal yet, but the fear was already there. It sat in his stomach, in his throat, in his fingers. It made the air thicker and the sound sharper, but it did not paralyze him. Not like before. Training hadn't driven her away, but it had given her a place. Fear was not an enemy that could be killed. She was a weight that had to be carried. Brennus was armed beside him. As Murmillo, he seemed even wider, even heavier. His large shield was almost as high as the upper body of a child. The helmet handed to him made his face disappear even before he put it on. Cassian, meanwhile, checked his equipment with excessive care and told a servant to make sure everything was in place. After all, he didn't want to die ugly. No one laughed out loud. But Lucius saw Nicanor, who didn't have to fight, briefly lower his eyes at the edge of the room. He had come along to carry equipment and do minor tasks. Maybe that's why Varro had chosen him, maybe Nicanor had asked for it. Lucius didn't know. But his presence calmed him down more than he had expected. Nicanor came to him when the servant went away for a moment. "I didn't write down your name," he said quietly. Lucius nodded. "Good. I'll wait until you come back." It was not a promise that Nicanor could control, and that is precisely why it meant a lot. Before Lucius could answer, a tremendous roar sounded above them. The crowd in the stands cheered for the first time. Perhaps the organizer had taken his place. Perhaps musicians had started. Perhaps the first performances have been announced. The ground seemed to pass on the noise, through stone, wood, and bone. The Colosseum had awakened. Not slowly, but like an animal that opens its eyes and feels hungry. The first program items took place without Lucius. He only heard them. Trumpets, cheers, cries of animals. Then another screaming, more human, shorter, more torn. Sometimes the crowd fell silent for a moment, then it broke out again. Under the arena, you couldn't see what was happening, and that was what made it worse. The performance filled the gaps. Lucius sat on a bench and stared at his hands. He thought of the many layers above him. At the top sat people who might be eating, laughing, or comparing bets. Downstairs, men were waiting to be called. There was only stone between the two. Two worlds in the same building. One was looking for entertainment. The other was looking for air. Marcellus sat down beside him. "Don't listen to everything," he said. "How am I not supposed to hear that?" "You hear it, but you don't follow him." Lucius looked at him. "What if I hesitate?" Marcellus did not answer immediately. "Then you might die. Or you live and have to live with hesitation. Both can be difficult." That was not a consoling answer, but it was an honest one. Lucius wanted to ask how many men Marcellus had killed, if he still saw their faces, whether he dreamed of them at night. But he did not ask the question. Perhaps he already knew the answer. Maybe he didn't want to hear them. An overseer appeared in the doorway. "Get ready." The room changed instantly. Men stood up. Straps were pulled one last time. Weapons. Helmets on. Voices fell silent. Cassian took a deep breath and put on his smile as if it were part of his armor. Brennus rolled his shoulders and mumbled names again. Lucius reached for his sword. The leather strap lay tightly under his fingers. He also whispered names. That of his mother. That of his brother. That of his village. So quiet that no one heard it. Then he put on the helmet. The world became narrower. The noise muffled and at the same time greater. His own breath filled the space in front of his face. Through the slit he saw only sections. Sand on the ground, Brennus's shield, Cassian's hand, Nicanor's face in the shadows. Nicanor raised his hand briefly. Lucius returned the gesture barely visible. Then they were led through a corridor. The ground rose slightly. The closer they got to the exit, the brighter it became. The noise of the crowd grew with every step. He was no longer distant, no longer subdued. He was waiting right in front of them, huge, alive, impatient. Lucius felt his heart beat faster. The corridor ended at a gate. Behind it was the arena. The gate was still closed, but bright light fell through cracks. Dust floated in it like gold. Lucius smelled the sand. He smelled blood, although he didn't see it yet. He heard a crier whose words were swallowed up by the crowd. Then trumpets. Then jubilation. An overseer stood next to the gate and looked at the fighters. When it opens, you go straight ahead. Don't stand still. Don't stand still. Lucius gripped his shield and sword more tightly. His legs felt heavy, but they carried him. The fear was still there, cold and hard. But underneath lay the decision he had made during the night. He would stand. Rome roared above him. The sand was waiting in front of him. There was no way back behind him. Then the heavy mechanisms began to creak. The gate shook. Light broke wider into the corridor. The noise of the crowd swelled until it crashed like a wave over Lucius. The Colosseum had called them. And now they stepped into his open mouth. Chapter 12. Fight for Glory. The light hit Lucius like a blow. For a moment he saw almost nothing. After the darkness of the corridors, the arena was dazzlingly bright, a wide circle of sand, stone, and sky. The noise of the crowd rushed down on him, so great that it no longer consisted of individual voices. It was a roar, a living monster of expectation, hunger, and enthusiasm. Lucius went on. "Don't stand still." He remembered the overseer's order, but he remembered Marcellus's voice even more. "Stand anyway." So he walked, even though his legs were heavy and his heart was beating against his ribs as if it wanted to break out. Next to him, the other gladiators moved into the arena. Brennus with his large shield, Cassian with his head held high, Marcellus calm as a man walking on familiar ground. To the audience, they may have looked strong, maybe heroic, perhaps fearlessly. Lucius knew how little of this was true. Thousands sat in the stands. He could not make out any individual faces, only rows of bodies, bright tunics, waving arms, colored cloths, open mouths. The crowd was everywhere. Above him, in front of him, behind him. Even the sky seemed to be filled with their noise. At the very bottom, close to the sand, sat the rich and powerful. There the faces were clearer, quieter. Some smiled. Some talked to each other as if the entrance of the gladiators were only the beginning of a good meal. The organizer of the games sat in the grandstand. Next to him are men in fine robes, officials, guests, and dignitaries. Lucius only looked briefly. It was pointless to look at the powerful for too long. They would not fight with him. You wouldn't feel his pain. And yet their gestures could decide whether a man lived or died. The gladiators lined up. A crier stepped forward and called their names. Each name was hurled into the arena and taken up by the crowd, distorted, amplified, devoured. Loud cheers broke out among well-known fighters. Marcellus received a deep, honest roar. He was a name that some people knew. Brennus received astonished shouts. They liked its size. Cassian raised his arm slightly, and sure enough, part of the crowd responded with laughter and applause. He understood his audience, even now. Then Lucius was named. The jubilation was smaller, but clear. Perhaps some remembered earlier exercise demonstrations or had read his name on the posters. Perhaps they liked the thought of a young fighter who had not often stood in the sand. Maybe they were just cheering because they wanted every fight to start with tension. Lucius felt the sound of his name on his skin. He had long longed to be seen as a human being. But this was not the kind of attention he had wanted. His name did not belong to him at that moment. He belonged to the crowd. She called him because she demanded something from him. Blood. Courage. Entertainment. Maybe death. After the performance, the first pairings were arranged. Not everyone fought at the same time. Some had to go back to the edge of the arena, others were prepared. Lucius only now finally learned who he was to fight against. His opponent was a secutor. The man stood on the opposite side of the sand, heavier armored than Lucius, with a smooth helmet, shield, and short sword. His body seemed compact, strong, determined. He wasn't a giant like Brennus, but he looked like someone who had learned to build up pressure and not back down. Through the narrow slit of his helmet, Lucius couldn't see his eyes, and that was exactly what made him threatening. It was as if he was not facing a human being, but a form of struggle itself. Lucius swallowed. He knew what a secutor meant: closeness, persecution, endurance. One such opponent wanted to close the distance, confront the other and overpower them with shield and sword. Lucius would have to remain mobile. He couldn't let himself be pushed against the wall of the arena. He must not tire too soon. And above all, he could not forget that under this helmet a man thought, breathed, and wanted to kill in order to live himself. The trumpets sounded. The fight began. At first, they moved slowly. Lucius raised the shield and immediately felt its weight. He had practiced this posture countless times in training, but here everything was different. The sand was deeper, the air hotter, the helmet tighter. The noise penetrated through the slit and made every thought heavier. His opponent did not immediately come running. He examined him. An experienced man. Lucius took the first step aside. The secutor followed. Another step. Again he followed. It was like a circle that slowly closed. Lucius wanted to keep space, but every step had to be wise. If he moved too fast, he would lose strength. If he moved too slowly, the opponent would confront him. The crowd grew impatient. She wanted the first blow. She wanted to see that the fight really began. The secutor gave it to them. He pushed forward suddenly, shield first. Lucius blocked, but the force drove him back. Immediately the sword, short and hard, came aimed at his side. Lucius turned his body, the blade sliding past his guard and only slightly tore over the leather. He felt no pain, but the proximity of the hit took his breath away. The crowd cheered. Lucius responded with a quick thrust against the edge of the enemy's shield. No hit, but the secutor had to raise his arm. Lucius took advantage of the moment, swerved to the left, and gained distance. Dama had taught him that a good attack didn't always have to hurt. Sometimes he just had to force a movement. The opponent came back. This time faster. Lucius saw the shoulder, saw the angle, raised his shield. The blow crashed against it, so hard that his arm became numb up to the elbow. The second attack followed immediately. Lucius backed away, but his foot didn't find a firm grip for a moment. Sand splashed. The secutor pressed on. The world narrowed down to shield, blade, breath, and dust. Don't see the crowd. But Lucius heard it. Of course he heard them. With every powerful blow they roared. They murmured every time they swerved. For them, it was a game of danger and skill. For him, it was a single mistake that should not have happened yet. The secutor wanted to tire him out. Lucius understood this after the first quick changes. He did not attack wildly, but heavily and regularly. Shield pressure, short blow, advance. Shield pressure, short blow, advance. He forced Lucius to react, forced him to hold up his arms, forced him to read the sand and not hit the boundary of the arena. Lucius had to break the rhythm. In the next attack, he pretended to retreat as before. The secutor followed, as expected. But instead of going further back, Lucius suddenly turned to the outside of the opponent's shield. His sword shot forward, narrowly, quickly, not at the body, but at the thigh. The blade hit. Not deep, not decisive, but she scored. The secutor tore the leg back. A red stripe appeared below the armor. The crowd screamed, thrilled by the first visible blood. Lucius felt a cold shock for a moment. He had scored in training, countless times. Wood against wood. Wood against body. But real blood was different. It made it all come true. His opponent did not stagger. Instead, he became more dangerous. The next attack came with fury. The secutor rushed forward, faster than before, and Lucius barely had time to raise his shield. The impact was brutal. He stumbled back. A second blow hit his shield at an angle and tore him to the side. Then came the sword. Lucius felt fire on his upper arm. He didn't scream, but the air escaped him abruptly. The blade had cut him. Not deep enough to render the arm unusable, but deep enough that warm blood ran out from under the arm guard. The crowd went wild. It was a real struggle for her now. For Lucius, it was a burning sign. He could die. Not at some point. Now. Fear rose in him. Not the cold fear of battle, but wild, raw panic. His body wanted to go back, away from this sand. A part of him saw his village again. Smoke, chains, the market, the school. Everything that had brought him here. Everything in him wanted to scream that it was enough. Then he heard a voice in his memory. Until the next breath. Lady. Lucius breathed. Once. The secutor came closer. Lucius breathed again. He raised his shield. The next blow crashed against it. This time Lucius stood firmer. The pain in his arm was there, but it belonged to him. He did not make it disappear, but he did not let it rule either. The secutor pressed. Lucius gave in, but only apparently. He made his opponent believe that he was faltering, that panic drove him back again. Then he suddenly lowered the center of gravity and thrust the shield upwards. The edge of the shield hit the opponent's helmet. The secutor lost sight for a breath. Lucius stepped aside, not striking wildly, but purposefully against the arm of the weapon. The blade cut over the opponent's forearm. This time Lucius heard the man panting under the helmet. The crowd literally jumped up. Lucius saw his opponent stagger, but not fall. Again a person stood opposite him, injured, breathing, struggling. For a tiny moment, their eyes met through the viewing slits. Lucius didn't see a beast. No matter. Only a man who didn't want to die any more than he did. The thought could have paralyzed him. Instead, he made it clearer. He couldn't hate this man. Hatred made you blind. He had to understand him. He had to see when the pain slowed him down, when his injured leg shortened the crotch, when his arm stayed down a moment too long after a blow. Not out of cruelty. From survival. The fight continued. The secutor was wounded, but still strong. Lucius's arm was bleeding, and his shield was getting heavier. Both men were breathing hard. The sand stuck to her legs. The sun was burning. The Colosseum was just a ring of noise. Again, the opponent attacked, this time with a deception. His shield came up as if to thrust Lucius into the chest, but the sword aimed low. Lucius realized it late, too late for a clean block. He threw himself aside. The blade grazed his leg splint. He rolled, got down on one knee, heard the cheers of the crowd, and saw the secutor above him. The opponent raised his sword. Lucius raised his shield. The blow crashed on it and almost drove him to the ground. The second followed. At the third, Lucius gave in, dropped to the side and kicked the opponent's injured leg with all his might. The secutor fell. Not elegant. Not heroic. Heavy and sudden, like a felled tree. The arena exploded. Lucius picked himself up. His whole body was crying out for air. The opponent was not helpless, but he was slower. He tried to push himself up with the shield. Lucius knew that this was the moment. In training, Damas shouted that he had to follow up. In the arena, no one called to help him. The crowd only called for a decision. Lucius stepped closer. His sword was ready. The secutor looked up at him. Again that look. The man under the helmet. The enemy who didn't want to be one. The adversary that Rome had given him. Lucius was able to kill him. Maybe he had to. His arm rose. The crowd became louder, more impatient, hungrier. Some shouted that he should strike. Others called his name. The organizer in the grandstand leaned forward. Everything was waiting for his movement. There was fame in that moment. Lucius felt it. A determined thrust, a victory, a jubilation that would drive his name into the stones of the Colosseum. This is how gladiators became famous. Thus, men who owned nothing became legends of the sand. But the price of this fame knelt before him. At mend. Bleeding. Human. Lucius paused. Not for long. Just a heartbeat. But a heartbeat was visible in the arena. A murmur went through the crowd. The secutor did not take advantage of the moment. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he understood. Perhaps he too was too exhausted to do more than wait. Lucius stepped on the edge of the opponent's shield with one foot and knocked the sword out of his hand. The blade flew into the sand. Then Lucius put the tip of his sword to the opponent's neck. The fight was decided. The secutor lay defeated below him, but not dead. Now the decision no longer belonged entirely to Lucius. He had won, but in Rome a victory was not always the end. The crowd went wild. disunited, intoxicated, mighty. Some wanted mercy. Others wanted blood. Hands moved. Voices were overturned. The organizer rose slowly. Lucius stood over his opponent and breathed heavily. His arm was bleeding. His legs were shaking. The sweat ran into his eyes under his helmet. But he did not fall. He stood. For the first time, he really understood what fame meant in the arena. He was not a light that warmed a man. He was fire. He could make a name bright, but he burned everything that came too close to him. Fame required courage, yes, but also blood. Sometimes your own. Sometimes someone else's. And the crowd loved a victor not because he was alive, but because he made them feel like they had looked death in the face. Lucius heard his name. Louder now. More clearly. Not like when entering. Different. As if they had recognized him. As if the young fighter in the sand had become someone to remember for a moment. But Lucius didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the man below him. And while the Colosseum shook, he waited for the verdict. Chapter 13. Thumb, Judgment and Fate. Lucius stood motionless in the sand. The tip of his sword lay on the neck of the defeated secutor, not firm enough to pierce the skin, but close enough for everyone in the arena to understand what had happened. The enemy was disarmed. His shield was half under Lucius's foot, his sword a few paces away in the sand. The fight was over. At least the part that two men with weapons could decide. Now the other fight began. The fight for the verdict. The Colosseum was louder than ever. The crowd no longer screamed out of enthusiasm, but out of desire. She wanted to have a say. She wanted to be part of the moment. A gladiator could fight, sweat, bleed and win, but in the end the last moment did not belong to him alone. It belonged to Rome. The spectators. The organizer. The signs that could make the difference between life and death. Lucius breathed heavily. Heat collected under his helmet. Sweat burned in his eyes, and the cut on his arm throbbed with every heartbeat. His shield arm felt numb. The fingers of his sword hand were cramped. He had one, but his body didn't know yet that the danger was over. Everything in him remained tense, ready for the next blow, which might not happen anymore. The secutor below him hardly moved. Only his chest rose and fell quickly. Lucius couldn't see his face, only the smooth helmet with a narrow slit. Behind it was a man whose name he did not know. A man who had tried to kill him a few moments ago. A man who might have had friends in some school, maybe memories of another life, maybe someone whose name he had whispered before the fight. The crowd didn't see that. She saw only the vanquished. And the winner. Lucius raised his eyes to the tribune. The organizer stood there, framed by men in bright robes. His face was calm, almost thoughtful. He enjoyed the moment. Lucius recognized this with bitter clarity. Not the clumsy nature of the crowd screaming for blood, but the finer way of a man who knew thousands were waiting for his sign. At that moment, the arena belonged to him. Not because he fought, but because he was allowed to decide. Lucius hated him for it. But hatred did not help. A crier raised his arms to incite the crowd even further. The voices swelled. Some cried out for mercy. Others after death. The words mingled, but individual shouts stood out. Let him live. Kill him. He fought well. Blood. Blood. Lucius heard them all as if they came from different worlds. How could the same struggle arouse such different desires? Some had seen courage and wanted to reward it. Others had seen blood and wanted more of it. Still others screamed only because screaming was contagious. Perhaps many did not even know what they really wanted. They just wanted to feel that their voice had weight. The secutor slowly raised a hand. Not to attack. He lacked the weapon and probably also the strength to do so. It was a gesture of submission, small and heavy. He acknowledged his defeat. He did not beg loudly for his life, but his movement said enough. Lucius felt his stomach tighten. At school, this moment had been explained to them. A defeated gladiator could ask for mercy. If he had fought bravely, if the crowd respected him, if the organizer wanted it, he was allowed to live. Sometimes courage, style, and popularity decided more than wounds. A cowardly fighter was spared less often. A brave loser was able to survive because his death was worth less than his return in a later battle. That was also cruel. Even mercy was not pure compassion in the arena. It was calculation. A good fighter cost money. A brave loser was able to inspire the crowd again the next time. Life and death were weighed like goods on a scale. Lucius held the sword steadily, though his arm trembled. The organizer turned to the crowd. He made her scream. Maybe he really listened to her. Maybe he was just pretending. Perhaps he had long since made his judgment. But he waited long enough for everyone to believe they were part of the decision. That was Rome. Power disguised as the will of the people, and the will of the people guided by power. Lucius thought of Nicanor. Rome makes men disappear. He thought of Brennus. The names of the dead are spoken so that the living know who they are. He thought of Marcellus. Stand anyway. The secutor below him breathed faster. Maybe he felt how long the moment lasted. Perhaps he had already experienced too often what came next. Lucius wondered if the man hated him, whether he accused him of having defeated him, or whether he only hoped that Lucius would act quickly if the verdict was fatal. Fast and clean. This thought alone made Lucius shrink back inwardly. He didn't want to kill. Not so. Not a man who lay disarmed in front of him. During the struggle, everything had been movement, danger, reaction. There, a push at the right moment might have meant survival. But now it was execution. And the crowd wanted to see them. Then the organizer raised his hand. The Colosseum did not become silent, but the noise changed. He contracted, became more tense, like a breath before a storm. Lucius saw the man's fingers, the movement of his arm, the faces next to him. For a moment, the whole world seemed to consist only of this hand. The sign came. Mercy, not death. Part of the crowd cheered. Another part booed and screamed disappointed. Some laughed, some waved, some called Lucius's name. The crier pronounced the verdict, his voice carried by the relief of some and the anger of others. The secutor was to live. Lucius lowered his sword. Only now did he realize that he had held his breath. The defeated gladiator remained lying for a moment, as if he could not trust the verdict immediately. Then helpers came into the arena. Two men approached cautiously, ready to intervene if something else happened. Lucius stepped back and took his foot off the shield. His opponent was raised. He swayed, but kept himself on his feet. For a brief moment, his helmet turned to Lucius. Not a word. Just a look through the narrow slit. Lucius didn't know if there was thanks, shame, or hatred in it. Maybe all at the same time. Then the secutor was led away, supported by the helpers, while blood dripped from his leg into the sand. The fight was over. Lucius had won. The crowd now wanted him. His name rolled through the Colosseum, stronger than before. Lucius. Lucius. Some clapped, others stamped their feet. The organizer nodded in his direction, as if Lucius had satisfactorily fulfilled a task. This nod felt more disgusting than any hit by the opponent. He had survived. But it still belonged to them. An overseer motioned for him to turn to the center. Lucius didn't understand at first. Then he remembered. The winner had to show himself. He had to accept the recognition, the jubilation, the fame. He couldn't just walk away like a man who was just glad he didn't die. The audience wanted a picture. A hero in the sand. A fighter who justified her enthusiasm. Lucius slowly raised his sword. The cheers were enormous. At that moment he felt the dangerous power of the arena. She gave something back. Not freedom, not peace, but a sense of greatness. Thousands called his name. People who had never known him stood up because he was still alive. For a man who had had everything taken from him, this noise could seem like a gift. Like proof that he existed. That he hadn't disappeared. That Rome had to see him. Lucius understood Cassian better now. He also understood why some gladiators became addicted to this moment. The jubilation filled gaps that loss had torn into a person. He was able to cover up the fear for a moment. He could make a slave feel like a king, at least for the duration of a breath. But Lucius also felt the trap. For the crowd did not love him for his sake. She loved what he had given her. Suspense. Danger. Blood. A verdict. If he seemed weak the next time, the same mouth that called his name today could demand his death tomorrow. Fame in the arena was not a possession. He was on loan. And the price was demanded again and again. Lucius lowered his sword and walked back to the edge of the arena. Each step was harder than the last. During the fight, he had not noticed his exhaustion. Now it came upon him like a flood. His wounded arm burned, his legs trembled, and there was a taste of dust and metal in his mouth. In the corridor under the Colosseum, the noise became more muffled, but it did not disappear. He penetrated through stone and wood as if the arena would not let him go. A servant took the shield from him. Another reached for the helmet. When the helmet was removed, cooler air poured onto his face. Lucius blinked. The world was bigger again, but also sharper. Nicanor stood in the shadows. His face betrayed more relief than he probably wanted to show. He did not immediately go to Lucius. Maybe he wasn't allowed to. Maybe he didn't know if words were appropriate. Finally, he just said, "You're back." Lucius nodded. "I'm back." Nicanor looked at his bleeding arm. "Sit down." Only now did Lucius notice how much blood was on him. Not just his own. The incision was not life-threatening, but deep enough that a doctor had to clean and bandage it. Lucius sat down on a bench. His hands trembled so much that he hid them between his knees. A doctor came, washed the wound with a burning liquid and pressed a cloth on it. Lucius gritted his teeth. The pain was clearer than the struggle. Smaller, but more personal. While the doctor was working, Lucius heard the next announcement outside. The games continued. His fight was already a memory for the crowd, a topic of conversation, perhaps the basis for bets. For him, however, every moment was still in his body. Cassian came by later, fully equipped for his own fight. His face was paler than usual, but he grinned. "They liked you," he said. Lucius looked at him tiredly. "That's not the same as winning." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "Yes. Sometimes it's exactly the same. And sometimes it's a cage." For a moment, Cassian's grin disappeared. Then he said more quietly, "A cage with applause is still better than one without." Lucius did not answer. He didn't know if Cassian was right. Maybe for some. Maybe on some days. But after the verdict on the secutor, it was clearer than ever to him that the arena didn't just threaten bodies. It seduced the soul. She made a man believe that the cheering sets him free, when he was only drawn deeper into the game. A short time later, Cassian was called. Lucius watched him as he walked up the corridor, the light in front of him, the noise above him. Cassian turned one last time and raised 2 fingers to his forehead as if greeting an invisible crowd. Then he disappeared. Lucius remained seated. He wanted to get up, but his body wouldn't allow it. Nicanor sat down next to him without asking. For a while, neither of them said anything. Outside, a new struggle began. The crowd roared again as if they had never roared before. As if every fight were the first. As if every man in the sand was made only for this moment. "How was it?" Nicanor finally asked. Lucius thought for a long time. He could have said, loudly, "Hot. Fast. Terrible. He could have told of the cut on the arm, of the look of the opponent, of the sign of the organizer, of the jubilation. But none of these words were enough. It was as if they were taking your life, he said slowly, and then giving it back to you for a moment so that you would be grateful to them for it. Nicanor looked at him, but said nothing. Lucius leaned his head against the wall. He was exhausted, wounded, and alive. Somewhere in the stands, people may still be calling his name. Perhaps they were already telling how the young gladiator had defeated the secutor and saved his life. Perhaps his reputation would grow. Perhaps Varro would be satisfied. Perhaps this victory would make him more valuable. More valuable. Not freer. This thought hurt more than the wound. But between all the bitterness, there was something else. Lucius had fought. He hadn't lost control. He had defeated an opponent without killing him at the last moment. He had stood in the sand while Rome roared, and had not broken. That meant something. Not for the organizer. Not for the crowd. For him. Later, when he was taken deeper into the preparation rooms, he heard the cheers of the spectators again. He didn't know yet whether Cassian had won. He also didn't know whether Brennus would return later. In the arena, fate changed quickly. A sign, a slip, a wrong breath, and a name became a memory. Lucius closed his eyes. He saw the organizer's hand again. The sign. Mercy. He wondered if his opponent was also sitting somewhere at that moment, connected, exhausted, alive. Whether he hated Lucius or was grateful to him. Whether they would face each other again one day. In Rome, everything was possible, especially the cruel. Thumb, judgment, and fate. It looked that easy from the stands. A gesture, a call, a decision. But for the men in the sand, it was more. It was the realization that her life hung on strings that held others. That courage did not always save. That victory did not always liberate. That grace was not always kindness. Lucius opened his eyes. His hand was wrapped around the leather strap on the hilt of the sword that Marcellus had given him. The battle was over, but its significance was only just beginning. He had seen how close death and glory were. He had felt how sweet the jubilation could be and how poisonous. And he knew that if he really wanted to be free, he had to survive more than just his opponent's blade. He also had to defeat the arena within himself. Chapter 14: The Price of Freedom. After his first big victory, Lucius' life changed, but not in the way he had imagined it before. When he had been new to Gladiator School, he had believed that victory must feel like liberation. He had thought that those who survived the arena would be able to breathe easier, at least for a moment. But when he returned to the Ludus after the games, his wound was bandaged, his body exhausted, and his name better known, but the walls were still in the same place. The gate was still locked. The guards were still doing their rounds. And Varro still had it. Nevertheless, something was different. The other gladiators now looked at him with a new look. Not reverent, not submissive, but more attentive. He was no longer just the young prisoner who trained with anger in his stomach. He had stood in the Colosseum, defeated an experienced opponent, and kept his composure. In the world of gladiators, this meant something. Not enough to be free, but enough to be seen. Cassian returned too, with a cut across his forehead and a smile that was more tired than usual. He had one. Of course he told it as if nothing else had ever been possible. Brennus had survived his fight, but not without severe bruises and a wound to his thigh. Marcellus came back last, quiet as ever. His opponent had not returned. Nobody asked him about it. Some things did not have to be said. In the days after the games, the school became quieter. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but more subdued. Those who had fought were given time to heal. Their wounds were cleaned, their bodies spared, as far as the purpose of the school allowed. Those who won were treated better. Not out of compassion, but because a successful gladiator was valuable. Better food, more rest, more careful care. Rome knew how to give rewards without giving up possessions. Lucius noticed it in little things. A guard did not beat him when he slowed down when he stood up. The doctor took more time for his arm. At mealtime, he received an extra piece of bread and some cheese. In the past, he might have been happy about it. Now every improvement tasted bitter. He had had to shed blood to get a little more bread. That was the price that Rome understood. Performance, obedience, spectacle, reward. Freedom, however, was something else. A few days after the games, Varro had him summoned. Lucius entered the Lanista's room with cautious tension. He had rarely been there. The room was larger than the gladiators' dormitories, but not ostentatious. Weapons hung on the walls, wax tablets lay on a table, and a slave stood in the corner, ready to pour wine. Varro sat behind the table and looked at Lucius for a long time before he spoke. "You fought well," he said. Lucius was silent. "Not perfect, but good. The crowd remembers you." "Is that good?" asked Lucius. Varro smiled weakly. "For me, yes. Maybe for you too." Lucius felt his hand involuntarily tense. "I'm still here." "Of course you're still here." This answer was so calm that it was more offensive than mockery. Varro got up and walked slowly around the table. "You think freedom is a gate that just opens if you're brave enough. That's how many people think at the beginning. And what is it really like? Freedom is expensive." Lucius looked at him. "For whom?" "For everyone." Varro took a small wooden gun from the table. A practice sword, hardly longer than a dagger. He turned it in his hand as if he were thinking about his own past. "A gladiator can become free," he said. "Some receive the wooden stick, the rudis, a sign that they no longer have to fight. Some buy their way out. Some are released by a rich patron. Some gain so much fame that their release itself becomes a spectacle." Lucius knew stories about it. Every gladiator knew her. They were whispered in the bedroom like prayers. A man who won enough victories could one day receive the rudis. Then he was no longer a fighter, but a free man, at least in the stories. For many, this thought was the only reason to get up again in the morning. "How many?" asked Lucius. Varro raised an eyebrow. "How many really make it?" The Lanista put the wooden sword back on the table. "Less than dreaming of." Lucius hadn't expected any other answer. Nevertheless, she hit him. "Then it's just another bait," he said. "No," Varro replied. "A bait is something wrong. Freedom is possible. But possibility is not a promise." Lucius hated that those words sounded true. Varro walked closer to him. "You're more valuable now than you were before your fight. That means better opponents, greater attention, maybe patrons. But it also means more danger. The crowd will expect something from you. If she knows your name, she won't be satisfied if you just survive. She wants to see why she remembers you." Lucius thought of the jubilation, to the fire of fame, of the trap inside. "And if I don't want to fight anymore?" Varro's gaze grew cold. "Then you remember that your will is not the reason you're here." There it was again, the truth without ornaments. Lucius left the room with a heavy heart. Outside, the daylight blinded him. Other men were already training in the courtyard. Wooden swords crashed against shields. An instructor screamed. Brenna slowly made his rounds to strengthen his injured leg. Cashin practiced a turn, although his forehead bandage was still fresh. Nicaner sat in the shade and scratched something into his wax tablet. The world went on. Later, Lucius sat down with Nicanor. The Greek did not look up. What did Varro want? "Explain to me that freedom is expensive." Nicanor nodded slowly. That's what men like to say when others own. Lucius had to smile briefly despite everything. "Do you believe in it?" he asked. To the rudis? Freedom through victories. Nicanor was silent for a while. Then he said, I believe that some men will be released. But I don't think Rome will give them everything back. Lucius understood. Even if a gladiator was released one day, the past remained in him. The dead did not disappear. The scars remained. The nights of waking up to the sound of the crowd in your head might never quite end. Freedom could open a gate, but it could not undo what had happened behind the walls. Brennus came up and sat down heavily on the floor. His leg was bandaged, but he didn't complain. Freedom, he said, as if he had heard the last word. In my homeland, there was freedom to get up in the morning and know that no one else owns your day. Cassian, who happened to be passing by, stopped. Very poetic for a man who usually only growls. Brennus looked at him. And for you? What is freedom? Cassian grinned at first, but then the smile slowly disappeared. That you can enter a room without wondering who is watching you. Nicanor looked up. That was honest. An oversight, Cassian said, and sat down with them anyway. Lucius thought about her answers. For Brennus, freedom was a morning of its own. For Cassian, it was an unobserved moment. For Nicanor, perhaps, the opportunity to write down names without fear that someone would break the tablet. For Lucius, freedom had long been just a return, back to his family, back to his village, back to a life outside Rome. But this life may no longer exist. This thought was more painful than any wound. What did freedom mean when the place you wanted to return to was only memory? When the people who would have expected you had disappeared? When you were no longer the one who was once swept away? Lucius had believed that freedom meant escaping Rome. Now he began to fear that Rome could also be carried within himself. In the weeks that followed, his name was actually mentioned more often. Visitors to the school asked about him. Varro had him perform at demonstrations. A rich citizen once sent him a small gift, an ornate arm guard, prettier than useful. Lucius didn't like to accept it, but rejection would have been stupid. At school, any sign of value could mean protection. Those who were popular were not easily wasted. But popularity was no protection from the arena. It was just a reason to be sent there again. Lucius trained harder than before. Not out of ambition alone, but because he now knew how quickly a real fight exposed every weakness. He practiced with the injured arm as soon as the doctor allowed it. He learned not to ignore the pain, but to classify it. He often talked to Dama about opponents, movements, deceptions. He watched Marcellus and saw how a man could fight without wasting unnecessary strength. But inwardly, his goal became clearer. He didn't just want to collect victories. He wanted to achieve freedom without losing what could make him free in the first place, his humanity. This realization was put to the test when the defeated Secutor was taken to school one day. Not permanently, only on the way to another ludus, because its owner had sold it. Lucius saw him in the courtyard, his thigh still bandaged, his forearm with a fresh scar. Without a helmet, he looked younger than Lucius had expected. Dark hair, tired eyes, a face that was neither cruel nor particularly hard. For a moment, they faced each other. None of the guards paid much attention to them. For the men, it was only a short stop, an organizational matter. For Lucius, however, the arena returned. The sand, the breath, the tip of the sword on his neck. The man recognized him. Lucius, he said. His voice was hoarse, but calm. Lucius nodded. I don't know your name. Severus. A Roman name. Maybe he was born in the Empire, maybe he had received it. Lucius didn't know. An unpleasant silence ensued. Then Severus said, You could have struck. Lucius returned his gaze. The verdict was not pronounced. Many would have done it anyway, to please the crowd. Lucius thought of the jubilation that had demanded blood. I didn't fight for her. Severus looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded imperceptibly. then hold on to it." Before Lucius could answer, Severus was led on. The moment was over, but his words remained. Hold on to it. It almost sounded like advice from an enemy who was no longer an enemy, or never had been. That evening, Lucius sat awake for a long time. In his hand he held Marcellus' leather strap, which he had loosened from the hilt of his sword to rewind it. He thought of Severus, to Varro, to the Rudis, of the many men who dreamed of freedom and yet only lived from fight to fight. The price of freedom was not just blood. He understood that now. The price was patience, pain, memory, the danger of getting used to the cheering, the temptation to see others only as obstacles, the constant decision not to become inhuman oneself in an inhumane world. Perhaps Rome could one day give a man the wooden staff. Perhaps a gate could be opened. Perhaps a name could be removed from the gladiators' lists. But true freedom had to start earlier, not only on the day of release, but at every moment in which a person refused to become completely what his masters wanted him to be. Lucius was not yet free. He had been wounded, imprisoned, and had become more valuable to those who made money from him. But inside him something was clearer than before. He would fight if he had to. He would survive if he could. He would use the fame without belonging to him. And when the day came when Rome offered him freedom, he would know that it did not come from the cheers of the crowd, not from Varro's hand, not from the blood of a defeated opponent, but from the part of him that neither chains nor walls nor the arena had been able to break. He would preserve this part, at any price. Chapter 15, Epilogue, Legend in the Sand. Years later, people in Rome were still talking about Lucius. Not all of them told the same story. Some claimed that he was the bravest gladiator to ever set foot on the sands of the Colosseum. Others said his battles were not the bloodiest, but the most memorable because he fought differently than many before him. Still others embellished his story until it was hardly recognizable what had really happened. In the taverns, in the markets, and in the narrow streets of the city, his name was passed on like a coin that passed through many hands and lost its original minting. Some called him the gladiator who looked his opponents in the face as if they were human. Others simply called him Lucius of the Sand. He himself might have just shook his head at these names. Because legends rarely arise the way people live. They cut away doubts, forget pain, smooth out contradictions, and turn a long, difficult path into a simple story. A man enters the arena. A man fights. A man wins. A man becomes free. So it was easy to tell. So a child could listen with wide eyes. So a merchant could captivate his listeners while wine was served and the sun sank behind the roofs of Rome. But Lucius' path had never been easy. After his first major victory, more fights followed. He won some of them clearly, others only barely. There were days when he left the arena upright while the crowd shouted his name. There were days when he had to be supported, with blood in his mouth and darkness in front of his eyes. He learned that no victory guaranteed the next. Every fight started all over again. Each opponent brought a new danger. Each wound could be the last, even if it seemed small at first. His name became better known. With fame came better treatment, better equipment, and greater expectations. Varro watched him with growing satisfaction, for Lucius brought honor and money to the school. Visitors wanted to see him. Some rich Romans sent gifts, others offered sums to have him perform at certain games. His face was recognized when he appeared at demonstrations without a helmet. People who would never have noticed him as a free man now spoke of him with admiration. But Lucius never forgot how dangerous admiration could be. He remembered Severus, the opponent from his first big fight, and his words, "Hold on to it." He remembered Nicanor's wax tablet, the names of those who had not returned. He remembered Brennus, who had once said that freedom means that no one else owns one's own mourning. He remembered Cassian, who laughed so that no one would see his fear. And he remembered Marcellus, who had taught him to stand despite fear. Not all of them accompanied him to the end. That was the cruel truth of the arena. Friendship could grow there, but it was never safe. Brenna survived several fights until a serious injury forced him to leave school. Whether he was sold, released, or deployed somewhere else, Lucius never knew for sure. Nicanor did not write his name on the tablet of the dead. He left a blank space, as if he refused to invent an ending he didn't know. Cassian became famous, albeit in his own way. The audience loved his gestures, his lightness, his play with the crowd. He won fights, almost lost others, and even turned pain into a performance. But one day he didn't come back laughing after a fight. He had won, but the price was high. A wound became infected, and his body, which had so often evaded death, could not flee fast enough this time. On his last night, he asked Nicanor to write his name particularly beautifully. "Not too small," Cassian whispered. "I was never small." Nicanor promised him. Lucius sat silently next to it, holding Cassian's hand until it grew colder. Later, when morning came and the horn echoed through the school as always, the world felt indecently the same. The instructors called. Men stood up. Shields were carried. Food was distributed. Rome did not stop when a person died. Lucius had known that for a long time, but every time it hurt anew. Marcellus did not die in the arena. At least not in the sand. He was so badly injured after many fights that he was never able to train properly again. For a gladiator, this could be worse than a quick death, because a body that could no longer fight lost its value. But Marcellus had earned respect over the years. Varro did not sell him to the mines, as others might have done. Instead, he stayed in school and later helped train younger men. He became harder with them than Lucius had expected. But one day he understood why. Marcellus did not want to torment her. He wanted them to live. His severity was not a lack of compassion, but the only form in which he could still show it. Lucius continued to fight. With each passing year, he became less the young man who had once come to school full of anger and more of a fighter whose movements were calm and precise. He learned not to chase the fastest victory. He learned to read opponents before they could read him. He learned to hear the crowd without obeying it. Sometimes he spared a defeated opponent when it was possible. Sometimes he couldn't. Not every story allowed for mercy. These nights were the hardest. Because Lucius didn't want to lie. He had killed. He had blood on his hands that no water could wash off completely. He had seen men die whose names he knew, and men whose names he would never know. The arena forced decisions for which there were no clean answers. If you wanted to survive, you sometimes had to do things that changed yourself. But Lucius tried not to forget. After every fight, after every death, he spoke a name, if he knew it. If he didn't know him, he would say a quiet word for the unknown man. Nicanor continued to write on his tablets until at some point he kept more names than a single person could carry in his memory. These tablets became something sacred among men. No overseer fully understood why. For the gladiators, however, they were proof that they had not been just shadows in the sand. Then came the day when Lucius received his rudis. It happened after a struggle that was often told later in Rome. Of course, the narrators exaggerated. They made his opponent bigger, his wounds deeper, the jubilation louder. In truth, it was a hard, long fight against an experienced man who wanted to live as much as Lucius. Both were exhausted in the end, both injured, both barely able to lift the shield. Lucius did not win by brute strength, but by patience. A step to the side, a final blow to the arm of the weapon, a disarmed opponent in the sand. Again, Lucius stood over a defeated man. Again the crowd shouted. Again there was a life under his blade. But this time something unexpected happened. Before the verdict was pronounced, part of the crowd began to shout his name. Then another. Then more and more. Not only for blood, not only for death, but for him. The organizer rose. Varro stood at the edge of the arena, his face motionless. And finally the wooden stick was brought. The rudis. A simple piece of wood. No gold, no marble, no magnificent sign. Only wood. And yet it was heavier than any sword Lucius had ever held. When it was handed to him, the Colosseum became a storm. The crowd cheered as if they were giving him freedom itself. Lucius stood in the sand, bleeding, exhausted, holding the wooden stick in his hand. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had dreamed of freedom for so long that he didn't know how it would feel when it really came. The gate had not yet been opened. The walls were still standing. Rome was still roaring. But there was a sign in his hand that said, "You don't have to fight anymore." Lucius didn't look at the crowd first. He looked at Nicanor, who was standing at the edge of the arena, older, narrower, but with the same alert eyes. Nicanor nodded. Not triumphant. Rather sad and proud at the same time. Then Lucius looked at Marcellus, whose face remained hard, while his eyes betrayed something else. Lucius lifted his rudis. The cheers grew louder. But inside it was quiet. Later, when the stories about that day emerged, many said that Lucius had finally become free at that moment. But he himself knew that freedom did not come about in a single moment. The wooden stick opened a door, yes. He ended the duty to fight in the arena. He made a free man out of a gladiator. But the real freedom had begun much earlier. In every moment he had refused to be just a weapon. After his release, Lucius did not immediately leave the school forever. He could have left. Perhaps he could have left Rome, traveled to a province, started a new life somewhere. But where should a man go whose past was burned and whose future was still nameless? He initially stayed close to the ludus. Not as a possession, not as a fighter, but as someone who still had to learn to wake up in the morning without expecting an order. That was harder than he had thought. Freedom didn't just mean that no one shouted when they had to get up. It meant having to decide for yourself who you were when there was no longer an arena to play a role. Lucius realized how deep school was in him. At the sound of metal, he turned around too quickly. His body tensed up in crowds. When someone called his name, he heard the Colosseum again for a moment. But slowly he learned. He sometimes helped Marcellus train the younger ones, but in a different way than the old instructors. He taught them to hold the shield correctly and to put their feet in the sand. But he also told them that fear was not a shame. He told them that an opponent is a human being. He told them to keep their names even if Rome gave them new ones. Nicanor collected the wax tablets with the names and hid them in a safe place. Perhaps, he said, someone would read it one day. Maybe not. The important thing was that they existed. And Lucius began to tell his own story. Not in the way Rome wanted to hear them. Not as a mere story of struggles, victories, and glory. But as a story of people behind helmets. Of prisoners, slaves, convicts, and volunteers. Of men who laughed even though they were afraid. Of friendship behind walls. Of a jubilation that sounded sweet and yet dangerous. Of freedom that cost more than blood. Many preferred to listen to the simple stories. They wanted to know how loud the Colosseum was. How it felt to defeat an opponent. Whether the thumb really decided on life and death. If Lucius had ever been afraid. Then he answered honestly. And always. Only fools and liars claim to know no fear. Over time, Lucius grew older. His scars didn't fade, but they became part of his body like lines in old stone. His name remained known in Rome, but in a different way than before. No longer as a promise of a coming fight, but as a reminder of a man who had survived the sand. Some made a hero out of him. Some a myth. Some said that he had never killed a defeated opponent, which was not true. Others claimed that he had fought wild beasts, which was also not true. Legends rarely care about truth. But perhaps Lucius thought that wasn't the most important thing. What was more important was that somewhere between all the exaggerations, a core remained. A human being can stand in a cruel world and still try to remain human. That was the truth he wanted to preserve. Not every gladiator was freed. Not everyone received a rudis. Not every name was remembered. Most of them disappeared in the dust of history, swallowed up by the noise of the crowd and the hunger of a city that always demanded new games. But for a moment they had lived, fought, hoped, and feared. They had been more than entertainment. More than bodies in the sand. More than casters under helmets. Lucius knew that. And as long as he lived, he said it. Later, when he walked past the Colosseum, he sometimes stopped. The massive building still towered over Rome, beautiful and terrible at the same time. The arches cast shadows on the streets, and from afar you could sometimes hear cheers again when games took place. Then Lucius felt the old pain in his arm, as if the scar remembered the first big fight. He looked up at the stands. There they had called his name. There they had demanded and celebrated his life. There, a prisoner had become a legend. But Lucius knew that his true story hadn't been written in the stands. Not even by the powerful in the tribune. It had been written in the sand, with footsteps, blood, choices, and memories. And every time the wind swept over the arena and redistributed the sand, the traces of the fights disappeared. But not everything disappeared. Some stories remained. Not because Rome preserved them, but because people refused to forget them.